Embark on the most expansive pirate saga ever told. From the terrifying glare of Blackbeard with smoke curling from his beard, to the cunning of Bartholomew Roberts, the fury of Charles Vane, and the defiance of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. This is not just history, it's the full legend of the Golden Age of Piracy. For the first time, all their stories are here, uncut and in one epic voyage. Strap in, the deck is yours. Chapter 1. Blackbeard.
When you hear the name Blackbeard, what image springs to mind? A towering man with fire in his eyes, smoke curling from his beard, pistols strapped across his chest, and a reputation so fearsome that sailors surrendered at the mere sight of him. But behind that terrifying figure was a real man, flesh and blood, with ambitions, fears, and a story that began far more quietly than the legends suggest. His true name was Edward Teach, though in some records he appears as Thatch, or even Tach. Like much about him, even his name is shrouded in uncertainty. What we know for sure is that he was born around 1680 in Bristol, England, a bustling port city where ships came and went daily, their decks stacked with cargo from the Americas and beyond. For a young man of that city, the sea was not just a possibility, it was a calling. Edward likely grew up amid the smell of tar and timber, watching merchant ships unload tobacco, sugar, and rum. Bristol was one of England's busiest trading hubs, a place where wealth and opportunity mixed with hardship and desperation. Many young men of his age took to the sea, some as sailors, others as privateers during England's wars. It seems certain that Edward Teach followed this path. He learned seamanship not from books, but from hauling ropes, climbing rigging, and bracing himself against the waves. We first glimpse him clearly in the early 1700s, during the War of the Spanish Succession. At that time, England had turned to privateers, essentially legalized pirates, to harass Spanish and French shipping. These men carried government papers known as letters of marque, which gave them the right to plunder enemy vessels. Edward Teach served as one of these men, gaining his first taste of sea combat. He would have learned the arts of boarding ships, firing cannons, and seizing cargo, all skills that would later define his career. But when the war ended in 1713, so too did the opportunities for privateers. Thousands of sailors suddenly found themselves unemployed. Their letters of marque were worthless, and the crowns they served no longer wanted them. Many of these hardened men turned to outright piracy, unwilling to give up the profits and freedom they had grown accustomed to. It was in this turbulent moment that Edward Teach began his transformation into Blackbeard. He joined up with the notorious pirate Benjamin Hornigold, who prowled the Caribbean and the American coast. Hornigold commanded a strong crew and operated from the pirate haven of Nassau in the Bahamas, a rough-and-tumble port city where law was weak and pirate law prevailed. Under Hornigold's command, Teach proved himself an able sailor and fighter. His skill and ambition quickly marked him as more than just another deckhand. In 1717, Hornigold rewarded him with his own command, a captured sloop. It was here that Edward Teach began to shape the persona that would make him infamous. He grew his beard long and black, twisting it into thick braids. He carried multiple pistols strapped across his chest and draped himself in a heavy coat to give his figure even more bulk. But his most terrifying innovation came in battle. He would tie slow-burning fuses beneath his hat, so that his face was wreathed in smoke and sparks. To his enemies, he looked like a demon risen from the sea itself. It was a brilliant piece of theatre. In truth, Blackbeard was no madman. He was a strategist. He knew that fear could win battles before they began. If a ship surrendered at the sight of him, there would be no need to waste powder or risk lives. And so, Edward Teach became Blackbeard, a name whispered across taverns, docks, and courtrooms from the Caribbean to London. But every legend has its roots in something human. Teach was said to be charismatic, even charming, when he wanted to be. His crew respected him not only for his ferocity, but also for his leadership. Unlike the tyrants of the Royal Navy, he understood the value of sharing spoils fairly and treating his men with a degree of respect. This balance, terrifying his enemies, yet maintaining loyalty among his crew, was the secret to his early success. By 1717, Blackbeard captured his most famous prize, a massive French slave ship called La Concorde. He refitted it with 40 guns and renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge. With this ship, he became one of the most powerful pirates afloat, commanding hundreds of men and a small fleet. His reputation spread like wildfire. To sail with him was to sail with the most feared man of the age. Yet in the flicker of lantern light below deck, or in the rare quiet moments on shore, Edward Teach was still a man who had chosen a life of rebellion and risk rather than obscurity. The boy from Bristol had become a pirate king, but he carried with him the same uncertainty that plagued all who lived outside the law. How long could such a life last? For those who sailed beside him, the answer was always uncertain. But one thing was clear: to step aboard Blackbeard's ship was to step into history. To understand what it was like to sail with Blackbeard, you must first imagine his ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. She was no ordinary vessel, but a floating fortress. Once a French slave ship named La Concorde, she was captured by Blackbeard in 1717 and transformed into one of the most fearsome pirate ships of the Golden Age. With 40 cannons bristling along her sides, she was as much a symbol as she was a weapon, and to serve aboard her was to be part of a legend in the making. Life aboard this ship was a mixture of hardship, routine, and sudden bursts of terror. For all the stories of treasure and revelry, the daily reality was far grimmer. The deck reeked of tar, sweat, and salt. The sails were patched, the ropes frayed, and the air was thick with smoke from cooking fires. Hammocks swayed below deck, crammed close together, where men slept shoulder to shoulder. Privacy did not exist, and the smell of unwashed bodies lingered everywhere. The day began at dawn. The boatswain's whistle roused the men, and the crew set about their duties. Some climbed the rigging to adjust sails, their hands raw from rope burns. Others scrubbed the deck with sand and seawater to keep it clean, or pumped bilge water from the lower holds. Cannons had to be cleaned and oiled, ropes coiled, sails repaired. It was endless toil, and yet each man understood that the strength of the ship meant the survival of the crew. Meals were simple and often unpleasant. Salted beef or pork, hardtack biscuits that broke teeth if not softened with water, dried peas, and the occasional fish caught from the sea. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare, and without them, scurvy was a constant threat. Rum was the crew's true sustenance, a ration given daily, mixed with water to make grog. It kept spirits up and dulled the hardships, but it also fueled quarrels and reckless bravado. Despite the hardships, there was a strange democracy aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. Unlike naval ships, where captains ruled with an iron fist, pirate captains relied on the loyalty of their men. Blackbeard commanded respect not just through fear, but through fairness. Shares of plunder were distributed according to a system. The captain received a larger portion, but every man was guaranteed a cut. Injuries were compensated. Lose a hand, and you might be paid in gold for your suffering. This sense of shared fortune kept men loyal in a way whips and chains never could. Yet Blackbeard was no fool. He knew that loyalty could not be taken for granted. He cultivated an aura of terror to remind his crew that he was more than a man. He was Blackbeard, the demon of the seas. In battle, he lit fuses in his beard, surrounding himself with smoke. His eyes gleamed in the firelight, and his voice carried above the roar of cannons. His men saw him not only as their leader, but as a figure of dread, someone who could terrify enemies into surrender. That reputation protected the crew as much as any cannon. But when the smoke cleared and the sails were furled, Blackbeard could be surprisingly charismatic. He shared rum with his men, listened to their concerns, and allowed them a voice in decisions. The Queen Anne's Revenge was run not as a tyranny, but as a brotherhood with Blackbeard at its head. For many sailors, it was preferable to the harsh discipline of the Royal Navy, where floggings and starvation were routine. On Blackbeard's ship, at least, you had a chance at riches, adventure, and a captain who knew the value of his crew.
The crew itself was a motley collection of men from across the world. Some were former sailors, others runaway slaves or indentured servants who sought freedom on the seas. Pirates cared little for where a man was from. What mattered was whether he could fight, work, and remain loyal. On Queen Anne's Revenge, you might hear English, French, Dutch, or African tongues spoken on the same deck, a floating world bound together by plunder and survival. Entertainment was scarce but treasured. Music was a common escape. Fiddles, drums, or even makeshift instruments filled the air when the day's work was done. Gambling was another favorite pastime, dice rattling across the deck as men wagered coins or even their meager possessions. And always there was storytelling, tales of battles fought, treasures buried, and ports visited. These stories grew taller with each telling, feeding the sense that life aboard Blackbeard's ship was larger than life itself. Yet beneath the laughter and bravado was always the knowledge of danger. Merchant ships might surrender at the sight of Blackbeard's flag, but naval warships hunted him relentlessly. Every shadow on the horizon could spell a fight for survival. Every night, men slept, knowing that tomorrow might bring glory or death. To sail with Blackbeard was to live on the edge of fear and fortune. His ship was both a home and a weapon, a place where hardship mingled with the promise of gold. For the men aboard Queen Anne's Revenge, the days were long, the work was hard, but the rewards were intoxicating. Under Blackbeard's command, they were not mere sailors. They were part of a legend, etched into history with smoke, steel, and fire. When sailors in the Caribbean whispered the name Blackbeard, it wasn't only his deeds they feared, it was the image of the man himself. Edward Teach understood something that many captains did not. Terror was a weapon sharper than any cutlass. To sail with him was to witness a master of psychological warfare, a man who could win battles without firing a shot, simply by appearing like a nightmare rising from the sea. Blackbeard stood well over 6 feet tall, a giant in an age when most men were shorter and slighter. His sheer size made him imposing, but it was his deliberate theatrics that etched terror into the hearts of his enemies. He grew his beard long and thick, braiding it into coils that spread across his chest. He tied slow-burning fuses beneath his tricorn hat, so that in the chaos of battle, smoke and sparks surrounded his face. His eyes glowed through the haze, and sailors swore they were staring into the face of the devil himself. Imagine standing on the deck of a merchant vessel, your ship outgunned and outmanned. Across the water looms the Queen Anne's Revenge, her black flag unfurled, cannons bristling from every side. And then, from the smoke, emerges Blackbeard, pistols strapped across his chest, cutlass gleaming in the firelight, beard ablaze with sparks. Would you fight such a vision, or would you surrender and pray for mercy? More often than not, ships chose the latter. But Blackbeard's fearsome image was more than vanity. It was strategy. By terrifying his enemies into submission, he spared his crew the bloodshed of battle. Every cannonball and musket shot wasted meant risk. Far better to win without fighting at all. Fear, after all, could be as profitable as powder and shot. His ship itself was a part of this performance. Black flags with skulls and hourglasses warned that death was near and time was short. These banners struck fear long before his crew ever boarded. Once a target saw the black flag flying from the Queen Anne's Revenge, they knew the odds were grim. Many surrendered without a single cannon fired, the crew tossing down weapons in exchange for their lives. Yet this aura of terror extended beyond enemies.
Even Blackbeard's own crew felt the weight of his presence. Though he ruled with more fairness than naval captains, he also maintained discipline through intimidation. A glare from him could silence a quarrel, and his reputation alone kept mutiny at bay. He cultivated an image that balanced fear with charisma, ensuring that loyalty was born not of chains, but of awe. There are stories, perhaps exaggerated, that he once shot at his own men during a feast, grazing them with pistol fire, simply to remind them that he was not to be taken lightly. Whether this tale is true or not, it captures the essence of his rule: unpredictable, commanding, and always a little frightening. His men followed him not just because he shared plunder fairly, but because they believed him larger than life. For those who sailed under him, there was a thrill in belonging to such a legend. Blackbeard's name struck terror across oceans, and being part of his crew meant sharing in that power. Theatrical as he was, he never risked his reputation lightly. He carefully cultivated the stories told about him, letting rumors spread and grow. Every tale of his cruelty, every whispered exaggeration, only added to the armor of fear he wore. And while his enemies dreaded him, some respected him. Accounts suggest that Blackbeard was not needlessly cruel. He preferred surrender to slaughter, plunder to pointless violence. His terrifying image was a mask, one that saved lives as often as it cost them. But for sailors caught in his shadow, it was impossible to separate myth from reality. Was he the devil incarnate, or simply a man who understood the power of performance? To sail with him was to see this performance unfold time and again. A ship spotted on the horizon, the order to prepare the cannons, the black flag raised, fluttering in the wind. And then Blackbeard himself, stepping into view, smoke curling around his face, as if the sea itself had summoned a monster. For his crew, these moments were intoxicating. They were part of a legend in motion, actors in a play of terror where the outcome was almost always victory. And so, Blackbeard's theatrics became his greatest weapon. He turned fear into currency, reputation into power. His beard, his smoke, his flags, these were tools as valuable as cannon and cutlass. To his enemies, he was a phantom. To his crew, he was both leader and legend. And to history, he became something greater than either, the very embodiment of piracy itself. To sail with Blackbeard was to live between two extremes, the promise of riches and the constant presence of death. His crew was a mosaic of humanity: sailors, escaped slaves, runaway indentured servants, and men who had once fought as privateers. Some joined him willingly, eager for adventure and profit. Others had little choice, pressed into service after their ships were captured. But once aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, they shared the same fate, a life bound to the most feared pirate captain of the age. Daily life for the crew was grueling. The ocean offered no rest. Men hauled ropes until their hands blistered, climbed rigging in storms, and labored to keep the cannons ready for battle at a moment's notice. Food was scarce and monotonous: hard biscuits, salted meat, dried beans. Rum was the one comfort, served in daily rations that kept spirits high but sometimes sparked quarrels. Sleep came in hammocks slung side by side, the air below deck thick with heat and the stench of sweat. And yet, despite the hardships, many men preferred this life to the alternatives. On a Royal Navy ship, discipline was brutal. Sailors could be flogged for the smallest infractions, paid poorly, and given no voice in decisions. Under Blackbeard, life was different. The crew shared in plunder, and decisions about raids and voyages were often discussed collectively. A pirate's Articles of Agreement, what we might call their code, set out clear rules about shares of treasure and punishments for misbehavior. Injuries were even compensated. To a sailor used to the lash, this was a strange kind of freedom. Still, there was no illusion that Blackbeard was simply another man. His charisma and terrifying reputation set him apart. Among the crew, he commanded loyalty not through chains, but through respect and awe. He was known to share rum with his men, laugh at their jokes, and reward bravery. But his presence carried a weight that reminded everyone he was captain first, companion second. His eyes could silence a quarrel. His voice could ignite courage in the heat of battle. The crew saw sides of him that outsiders did not. Beneath the smoke and theatrics, he was a shrewd strategist. He knew when to fight and when to avoid unnecessary risk. He was not a tyrant, eager to spill blood for its own sake. Many of his men understood that their survival depended on his careful balance of fear and cunning. To them, Blackbeard was not just the devil of the seas. He was their protector, the man who kept them alive and prosperous. But life under his command was also unpredictable. Blackbeard's moods could shift quickly, and his sense of theatre extended even to his crew. There are accounts, likely exaggerated, that he once fired pistols under the table during a feast, wounding his own men to remind them of his power. Whether true or not, the story reflects how his crew felt: loyal, but wary. To sail with Blackbeard was to live under the shadow of a man who was as much myth as reality. For new recruits, life aboard his ship was a test. Some joined willingly, enticed by stories of plunder. Others, captured from merchant ships, were given a choice: join the crew or be marooned. Many chose the former, though not all stayed long. Loyalty had to be earned, and Blackbeard's crew was quick to test the courage of newcomers. A man who shirked his duties or failed to fight bravely in battle soon found himself cast aside, or worse. Despite these tensions, the camaraderie among the crew was real. Music, dice games, and storytelling filled the hours between toil. Around the firelight of lanterns, men swapped tales of ports visited, treasures seized, and the terrifying image of their captain that struck fear into the hearts of enemies. To belong to such a crew was to share in a legend, and even the harshest days at sea carried the thrill of being part of something greater than oneself. At times, however, the crew also felt the weight of their captain's ambition. When Blackbeard blockaded Charleston in 1718, holding an entire port city hostage until he was supplied with medicine, his men tasted the heights of power and the edge of disaster. Such boldness meant riches, but it also drew the wrath of powerful enemies. They knew every victory brought them closer to the gallows, and every raid made their captain's name more infamous. To sail with Blackbeard was to accept this bargain. The men who followed him lived with the knowledge that their lives would likely be short, but filled with more wealth, freedom, and notoriety than they could ever dream of ashore. They trusted him because he gave them what no navy, no merchant ship, no master could: a sense of belonging, equality, and purpose. Still, the question lingered in every mind: how long could it last? Was Blackbeard truly invincible, or would his smoke and fury one day falter against the cannons of the Royal Navy? For the men aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, that answer was always just over the horizon. For all the hardship of sea life, the true allure of piracy was the promise of plunder. And when it came to raids, Blackbeard's name inspired both terror and surrender. To sail with him was to witness one of the most effective pirate commanders of the age at work, orchestrating strikes that were as much about reputation as they were about profit. Blackbeard's favored hunting grounds stretched from the Caribbean up the American coast, where merchant ships plied busy trade routes laden with goods. Tobacco, sugar, rum, indigo, and most importantly, gold and silver, all floated across the waves in vulnerable wooden hulls. To his crew, each sail spotted on the horizon was a chance for fortune. The approach to a raid was often deliberate, almost theatrical. The lookout in the crow's nest would cry out, and the crew would spring into motion. Cannons were primed, sails trimmed, weapons readied. Blackbeard would stride the deck, his towering figure visible to all, a cutlass at his side and pistols across his chest. And then, when the distance closed, the black flag was raised, a signal as unmistakable as death itself. Many ships, at the sight of this, simply surrendered. After all, resistance against the Queen Anne's Revenge, with her 40 guns and hundreds of hardened men, was folly. Better to hand over cargo than risk life and limb. For the crew, these were the easiest victories. No blood spilled, no cannon fired, only treasure secured. Yet the tension never disappeared. Until the white flag of surrender was raised, no pirate could be sure what the next minute would bring. When resistance did come, it was swift and brutal. Blackbeard's men were seasoned fighters. Grappling hooks lashed ships together, and boarding parties swarmed the decks. Pistols cracked, cutlasses rang, and the air filled with smoke. In these moments, the crew saw their captain at his most fearsome. Blackbeard strode through battle like a phantom, his smoking beard framing his face, his voice bellowing commands above the chaos. To fight under him was to feel unstoppable, and many sailors claimed that his mere presence turned the tide of battle. The spoils were varied. Sometimes the prize was modest, barrels of flour, crates of tobacco, or cheap cloth. Other times the haul was dazzling. Gold coins spilling from chests, silver plate gleaming in the lantern light, fine wines and brandies, silks, spices, and weapons. For men who had lived on hardtack and brine, these treasures were intoxicating. The moment when the captured goods were hauled aboard was one of jubilation. Rum flowed, dice rolled, and laughter filled the air. Blackbeard, however, was no reckless spendthrift. He understood that raids were about more than immediate wealth. They were about building and maintaining power. He chose his targets carefully, striking at vulnerable merchantmen while avoiding larger naval ships. He cultivated a reputation for overwhelming strength, so that future victims would surrender without a fight. Every raid was a performance designed to reinforce the legend. The most infamous of these raids came in May 1718, when Blackbeard blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina. With several ships under his command, he captured merchant vessels as they attempted to leave the harbor, holding them and their passengers hostage. His demand was not gold or jewels, but medicine, supplies for his crew, who were stricken with disease. For nearly a week, Charleston was paralyzed, its citizens gripped by terror. Eventually, the medicine was delivered, and Blackbeard released his prisoners unharmed. To his men, this was a demonstration of his cunning. He showed the world that he could hold an entire city at his mercy, yet temper brutality with pragmatism. For the crew, raids meant reward. Pirate codes ensured that plunder was divided according to strict rules. The captain and officers took larger shares, but every man received something. Even those injured in battle were compensated, an acknowledgement of the risks they bore. A missing finger might mean additional silver, while the loss of a leg could earn a fortune, though no sum could truly replace the hardship. And yet, despite the wealth, there was always danger. Each raid risked the attention of the Royal Navy. Each victory brought the threat of retaliation closer. The men aboard Queen Anne's Revenge knew they lived on borrowed time, but the thrill of victory and the sight of treasure outweighed such worries in the moment. To them, the raids were not only about survival, but about living with a freedom few men could ever taste. After a successful capture, the ship would often erupt into celebration. Music filled the deck, mugs of rum clinked, and men boasted of their bravery. Blackbeard himself sometimes joined in, though always with an air of control. He laughed with his men, but never let them forget who he was. For his crew, these nights of revelry were proof that they were part of something extraordinary. Brothers united under the black flag of a living legend. But the victories were fleeting. The seas were vast, and the noose of the authorities was tightening. For now, though, the crew of Blackbeard's ship revelled in their plunder, basking in the glory of a captain whose very name struck fear across oceans. To sail with him was to live in the moment, chasing fortune one raid at a time, knowing that tomorrow the horizon might bring another prize, or the end of it all. For all the tales of storms and sea battles, piracy did not exist entirely upon the waves. Even the most feared captains had to bring their ships ashore. And for Blackbeard, ports were as much a stage as any battlefield. To sail with him was to witness not only terror at sea, but the careful dance of diplomacy, indulgence, and danger that came when the anchor was dropped. The pirate haven of Nassau in the Bahamas was one of Blackbeard's earliest strongholds. After the War of the Spanish Succession, it had become a safe haven for outlaws, privateers, and opportunists. Its streets were sandy, its taverns rowdy, and its jails perpetually overcrowded. There, Blackbeard could find recruits, repair ships, and trade plunder. Merchants, though wary, were willing to deal with pirates if it meant profit. In the crowded taverns, filled with smoke and laughter, Blackbeard was both feared and admired. To his crew, Nassau was a place of respite, a chance to drink, gamble, and spend their shares of treasure. But Blackbeard's ambitions stretched beyond lawless havens. In 1718, he famously accepted the king's pardon offered by Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina. For a time, he lived in Bath, presenting himself not as a pirate, but as a gentleman. He entertained guests in his home, dined with local officials, and courted respectability. To his crew, this was a startling transformation. The same man who had strode the decks with smoking beard and pistols now appeared in fine clothes, speaking with authority in the governor's company. It was a reminder that Blackbeard was not only a pirate, but a man of cunning who could shift roles when it suited him. This duality, pirate at sea, gentleman ashore, was part of his genius. He understood that to survive, he needed allies as much as he needed fear. Governors could be bribed, merchants could be persuaded, and communities could be won over with gifts of plunder. For the crew, these moments ashore were both a relief and a warning. They could drink and feast, but they also saw the risks of their captain's high profile. Every appearance in port drew attention. Every deal brought them closer to betrayal. The ports were also places of temptation. Crewmen, flush with coin, flocked to taverns and brothels, sometimes squandering their shares in a single night. Rum flowed freely, dice rattled across tables, and fights broke out as easily as laughter. For some pirates, these were the happiest moments of their lives, brief spells of indulgence before returning to the harshness of the sea. For others, they were dangerous distractions, weakening discipline and drawing the eyes of colonial authorities. Blackbeard himself played these ports carefully. In Nassau, he cultivated the image of the pirate king. In Bath, he donned the mask of respectability. To the outside world, these contradictions seemed confusing. To his crew, they revealed his pragmatism. He was a man who knew when to roar and when to smile, when to terrify and when to charm. It was another layer of his theatrics, another tool in the arsenal that kept him alive longer than most of his kind. Yet the risks were real. Governors might accept bribes, but they also feared London's wrath. Merchants might trade secretly with pirates, but they could not be trusted. In every port, there were spies, informants, and rivals. To sail with Blackbeard meant sharing in the spoils ashore, but also living with the knowledge that betrayal could be waiting in the next tavern. The blockade of Charleston had shown just how bold Blackbeard could be ashore. By holding the city hostage for medicine, he demonstrated power unlike any other pirate of the time. But such boldness came with a cost. After Charleston, colonial authorities could no longer ignore him. His visits to port became more perilous, his movements more closely watched. For his crew, this meant fewer safe havens, fewer chances to rest. Still, when the ship docked, spirits soared. The smell of cooking fires, the sound of fiddles in taverns, the touch of dry land beneath weary feet, all of it reminded the men why they endured the hardships of the sea. For a night or two, they could live like kings. They could drink until dawn, gamble until their purses were empty, and swagger through the streets with the pride of men who sailed under Blackbeard's flag. But even in these moments of indulgence, the shadow of the noose loomed. Every port held gallows, stark reminders of what awaited captured pirates. Every man knew that his revelry could be cut short by capture, betrayal, or the sudden arrival of a Royal Navy ship. And so, the laughter in the taverns was always tinged with unease, the rum always mixed with the taste of danger. For Blackbeard's crew, port life was a paradox, freedom and fear intertwined. Ashore, they saw their captain as both a feared outlaw and a man capable of walking among gentlemen. They revelled in the spoils of their raids, but they also felt the tightening grip of the world against them. In the flickering lamplight of a tavern, as dice rolled and mugs clinked, they lived in the moment, knowing that tomorrow they might once again be chased across the seas. To sail with Blackbeard was not only to fight at sea, it was to live in the liminal space between outlaw and legend, where every step ashore could bring fortune, betrayal, or both. For all his cunning and theatrics, even Blackbeard could not escape the tightening grip of the authorities. By late 1718, the Royal Navy had grown weary of his raids, blockades, and growing influence. Governors who once winked at his bribes now feared reprisal from London. And so, the end came swiftly, in the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet, North Carolina. To sail with Blackbeard in those final days was to stand on the edge of legend and doom. In November of that year, Blackbeard anchored at Ocracoke with a small company of loyal men. The Queen Anne's Revenge had already been lost earlier that year, run aground near Beaufort, leaving him with fewer ships and fewer crew. Still, his presence remained a threat. Reports reached Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia, that Blackbeard lingered in those waters. Determined to end the menace once and for all, Spotswood dispatched Lieutenant Robert Maynard with two small sloops, the Ranger and the Jane. On the morning of November 22nd, Maynard's vessels crept into the inlet. Blackbeard, though surprised, did not hesitate. He rallied his men, their numbers no more than 2 or 3 dozen, against Maynard's larger force. To his crew, it must have felt like standing beside a lion cornered, but still roaring. Even with fewer men, Blackbeard radiated confidence. His pistols were loaded, his cutlass sharpened, and his beard, wild as ever, framed a face that seemed born for such an ending. The battle began with cannon fire. Blackbeard unleashed a broadside that ripped into Maynard's sloops, killing and wounding many of his men. The inlet filled with smoke, and the crash of cannon echoed across the water. But Maynard had a plan. Knowing his ships could not withstand repeated broadsides, he ordered his men to stay hidden below deck after the first barrage, leaving the decks seemingly empty. Blackbeard, seeing what looked like a crippled enemy, closed in for the kill. His men prepared to board, grappling hooks ready. But as they leapt onto Maynard's sloop, a deadly surprise awaited them. Maynard's men surged up from below, muskets and pistols blazing. The deck erupted into chaos, a brutal melee of cutlasses, axes, and gunfire. Amid the smoke and blood, Blackbeard fought like a man possessed. Witnesses later swore that he battled with the strength of 10 men, his massive frame cutting through foes as though fate itself had lent him power. He fired pistols at near point-blank range, swung his cutlass with devastating force, and bellowed commands to rally his dwindling men. For his crew, it was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a final vision of the captain who had built his legend on smoke and fury. The fight was savage. Men slipped in pools of blood, muskets cracked, and the clash of steel rang out over the roar of the sea. Maynard himself confronted Blackbeard, and the two clashed in a duel that has since passed into legend. Cutlass against sword, pistol against pistol, They fought in the thick of the melee, each blow echoing the larger struggle between law and lawlessness. But even legends are made of flesh. Blackbeard was struck again and again. Musket balls tore into his body, blades slashed across his frame. Still he fought on. Accounts say he took no fewer than 20 wounds, 5 from gunfire and more than a dozen from blades, before he finally collapsed. With his fall, the battle ended. His men, seeing their captain slain, surrendered or were cut down. Maynard ordered Blackbeard's head severed from his body. It was hung from the bowsprit of the Jane as a grim trophy, proof that the demon of the seas had been slain. His body, weighted and thrown into the waters of Ocracoke, was said to have swum around the ship 3 times before sinking, a story as legendary as the man himself. For his crew, the sight of their captain's end was both devastating and inevitable. They had sailed with a man who seemed invincible, only to discover that even Blackbeard could be brought low. In that moment, the era of their legend ended. The man who had led them through raids, blockades, and feasts of plunder now lay silent beneath the waves. For the survivors, chains awaited. For history, a myth was born. To sail with Blackbeard on that final day was to witness a spectacle of bravery, fury, and inevitability. The smoke, the blood, the roar of cannon, all of it burned into memory. His crew had followed him into countless dangers, but this was the end none could escape. And yet, as the sea swallowed his body, his name did not vanish. Blackbeard the man was gone, but Blackbeard the legend had only just begun. When Blackbeard's body slipped beneath the waters of Ocracoke Inlet in 1718, his story might have ended there. Another outlaw slain by the law, another corpse claimed by the sea. But Blackbeard was never just a man. He had spent years crafting himself into something larger, something terrifying and unforgettable. And so, while his flesh perished, his legend only grew. News of his death spread quickly. In colonial ports, sailors spoke in hushed tones of the battle, retelling it with each tavern mug of rum. The details grew more dramatic with every telling. Some swore that his body swam around Maynard's ship 3 times before sinking, as if even death could not claim him without a final display of defiance. Others whispered that his ghost lingered in the inlet, haunting the waters where he fell. Whether believed or not, these tales ensured that Blackbeard lived on in imagination long after his life ended. Part of what made his legend endure was how carefully he had cultivated it while alive. Unlike many pirates who lived and died in obscurity, Blackbeard had built a persona so fearsome that it outlasted him. The smoking fuses in his beard, the pistols across his chest, the black flag that fluttered above his ship, all became symbols of piracy itself. He had made himself into a story, and stories are far harder to kill than men. Writers in England eagerly seized upon him. Newspapers published accounts of his battles and his death, often embellished for readers eager for both fear and entertainment. Pamphlets and broadsheets circulated, painting him as the very embodiment of pirate cruelty. The General History of the Pirates, published just a few years later, devoted whole sections to his exploits. Its pages immortalized him alongside the likes of Bartholomew Roberts and Anne Bonny, cementing him as the archetype of the pirate captain. But not all remembered him as a monster. To his crew, he was a leader who balanced fairness with ferocity, a man who rewarded loyalty and fought with them to the end. Even his enemies sometimes admitted his cunning, noting that he preferred intimidation over unnecessary bloodshed. This duality, demon to some, hero to others, only made his legend richer. He was not a one-dimensional villain, but a man whose complexity fascinated generations. Over the centuries, Blackbeard became more than history. He became folklore. In North Carolina, fishermen claimed to see strange lights near Ocracoke, said to be the spirit of Blackbeard searching for his head. Ghost stories placed him wandering beaches, his shadow cast on stormy nights. In literature, He was reinvented as the quintessential pirate, appearing in novels, plays, and eventually films. Each retelling reshaped him, but the essence remained. Blackbeard was the pirate of pirates, the face of an age now long past. Why does his legend endure while others fade? Perhaps it is because he embodied the contradictions of piracy itself. He was both ruthless and pragmatic, terrifying and charismatic. He lived by rebellion, but sought moments of legitimacy. He created fear, not out of madness, but out of strategy. To his crew, he was a brother and a commander. To his enemies, he was a phantom of dread. To history, he became a symbol of freedom and defiance, however violent that freedom was. For those who sailed with him, the memories must have been haunting. They had seen the man up close, laughing over rum, striding the deck in smoke and sparks, facing death without flinching. To live in his shadow was to live on the edge of the impossible, part of a story that felt more like myth than reality. And when the gallows claimed so many pirates, it was fitting that Blackbeard's end came not with rope and silence, but with cannon fire and legend. Even today, the name Blackbeard carries a weight. Say it, and images come unbidden. A giant with smoking beard, eyes burning through the haze, his ship looming against the horizon. We may know more of the truth now, that Edward Teach was a man shaped by war, circumstance, and cunning. But the myth still holds power. He has become what he always intended, unforgettable. And so, when we tell his story, we do not simply recall a man. We summon a legend. We walk again on the deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, hear the roar of cannons, feel the salt spray of battle, and watch the towering figure of Blackbeard stride through the smoke. His time was brief, his reign violent, but his shadow stretches endlessly across the sea of history. To sail with Blackbeard was to sail with a man who turned himself into a myth. And though the waves have long since closed over his body, the legend still rises, fierce and unyielding, like smoke from an eternal fire. And so, Blackbeard's story drifts into legend. His life burned brightly, and his death only made the myth stronger. He remains the face of piracy, the phantom that still haunts our imagination. But Blackbeard was not the only pirate whose name thundered across the seas. In fact, another would rise who was even more successful, capturing more ships than any other man of his age. His name was Bartholomew Roberts, known to history as Black Bart. Where Blackbeard relied on terror, Roberts ruled with discipline, cunning, and a surprising code of conduct that made him the most formidable pirate of them all. That will be our voyage next time. Until then, thank you for joining me tonight. If you could sail with a pirate crew, would you choose the chaos of Blackbeard's smoke and fury, or the iron order of Bartholomew Roberts? Tell me in the comments below, because I'll be reading them while preparing our next tale. Fair winds, and may your dreams tonight be filled with the sound of distant waves and the whisper of sails.
Chapter 2. Bartholomew Roberts.
Imagine this. You're a sailor on a quiet merchant vessel, the trade winds carrying you steadily across the Atlantic. The sea is calm, the crew relaxed, and the voyage feels safe, until a dark silhouette emerges on the horizon. At first, it looks like any other ship, but then you see the black flags fluttering, the gun ports sliding open, and the terrifying realization sets in. You've been spotted by Bartholomew Roberts, better known as Black Bart. For many sailors of the early 18th century, this was the worst possible fate. Black Bart was not only ruthless, he was efficient. Unlike Blackbeard, who relied on smoke, fury, and theatrics, Roberts ruled with strict order and military precision. He captured more than 400 ships in his short career, far more than any other pirate of the Golden Age. To be hunted by Roberts was less a matter of if you would lose, and more a matter of how quickly you would surrender. But here's the remarkable part. Roberts never wanted to be a pirate. Born John Roberts in Wales, he had been a respectable sailor, a man who lived within the law. He was swept into piracy almost by accident, pressed into service against his will. And yet, within weeks, he rose to command the very men who had captured him. Through sheer courage, intelligence, and leadership, he became the most formidable pirate captain of them all. To sail with Black Bart was not to live in chaos, as aboard so many pirate ships. It was to live under a code, one enforced with discipline and order. No gambling, no drinking on duty. Lights out by 8. If you broke his rules, punishment was swift and merciless. But for those who followed him, there was safety, profit, and the thrill of sailing with a captain who always seemed to win. Roberts was not like other captains. He dressed in fine clothes, carried himself with elegance, and wore a silver cross around his neck. He was a man of contradictions, deeply religious, yet a pirate, strict and disciplined, yet charismatic enough to win loyalty, ruthless in battle, yet refined in manner. To his enemies, he was a nightmare. To his crew, he was both a commander and a symbol, proof that a pirate could be more than a drunken cutthroat. Tonight, we'll step aboard his ship. We'll see what life was like under his command, how he rose from reluctant pirate to feared admiral of the Black Flag, and how he carved his name into history as the most successful pirate who ever lived. So settle in, let the waves rock gently in your imagination, and prepare to meet a man who turned piracy into something far more disciplined, far more dangerous, and far more successful than anyone before or since. This is the story of Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the gentleman pirate. Bartholomew Roberts did not begin life with the look or spirit of a pirate. In fact, he may be one of the few great captains of the Golden Age of Piracy who entered that world entirely against his will. He was born John Roberts in 1682 in the small Welsh village of Casnewid Bach, near Pembrokeshire. It was a place of rolling hills, stone cottages, and quiet harbours. Life was hard, work was scarce, and the sea promised both employment and escape. Like many young men of coastal Wales, John took to ships not out of adventure, but necessity. His skill and temperament soon earned him steady work as a sailor, where he gained experience in navigation and seamanship. By his early 30s, Roberts was serving aboard a slave ship sailing out of West Africa. He was a skilled navigator, a man who kept order, but not a man who stood out as reckless or daring. If fate had not intervened, he might have lived and died in obscurity, remembered only by the logbooks of merchant vessels. But the sea, as always, had other plans. In 1719, while serving aboard the slave ship Princess, Roberts's life was upended. The ship was anchored off the coast of Ghana when it was attacked by pirates led by Captain Howell Davis. The pirates overwhelmed the crew, plundering the ship and forcing survivors to join them. Roberts was one of those pressed into service. Imagine his situation. One day a respectable sailor, the next a captive forced to choose between death, marooning, or piracy. He chose life. But Roberts was no ordinary recruit. He quickly distinguished himself. Within weeks, Davis recognized his skill as a navigator and his level-headedness under pressure. Roberts was not rowdy or reckless like so many pirates. He was composed, disciplined, and intelligent. Davis began to trust him, and Roberts rose in influence despite his initial reluctance. Then came the turning point. In June 1719, Captain Howell Davis was killed in an ambush on the island of Principe. The crew, enraged and leaderless, needed a new captain. Dozens of hardened pirates stood before them, men who had lived by the cutlass for years. Yet they chose Roberts, the reluctant newcomer, as their leader. Why? Because even in those few weeks, Roberts had shown the qualities they valued most: courage, judgment, and the ability to command respect. It is said that Roberts, upon being elected, remarked, "It is better to be a commander amongst rogues than a commoner in the regular army." If he was hesitant before, That moment marked the start of his transformation. Roberts may have been forced into piracy, but he embraced leadership with both hands. Almost immediately, he proved himself. His first decision as captain was to avenge Davis's death. He led his new crew back to Principe, where they attacked Portuguese ships and raided the town. It was a bold move, reckless to some, but to his men, it showed that Roberts was not afraid to act decisively. His reputation was born that day.
Roberts's rise was remarkable because it was built not on theatrics, like Blackbeard's, but on order. Where other captains relied on terror and chaos, Roberts imposed discipline. He wore fine clothes, drank tea instead of rum, and insisted on structure aboard his ship. To men used to disorder, his methods might have seemed strange, but they worked. His crew began to see that under Roberts they had the best chance at profit and survival. But for Roberts himself, the transformation must have felt surreal. Only months earlier, he had been a reluctant recruit. Now he stood at the helm, dressed in rich crimson coats, pistols at his belt, commanding hundreds of men. The Welsh sailor from a quiet village had become the master of a pirate fleet. Still, it is worth remembering that Roberts never truly set out to be a pirate. He was pulled into it by circumstance, swept into a tide too powerful to resist. And yet, once he accepted the role, he became something extraordinary. He was not just a pirate captain, he was a pirate admiral, leading with a combination of discipline, charisma, and daring that made him the most successful of them all. For his crew, those early days were a revelation. They had chosen a man who seemed reluctant, but who quickly proved himself bolder, sharper, and more reliable than they could have hoped. To sail with Roberts was not to follow a drunkard or a brute. It was to follow a man who knew the sea, who commanded respect, and who seemed destined to carve his name into history. When Bartholomew Roberts first took the captain's place, few could have predicted what kind of leader he would become. Many pirates elected their captains quickly, often in moments of anger or desperation, and those same captains could be deposed just as quickly. But Roberts was different. From the moment he donned the mantle, he carried himself not just as a pirate captain, but as something greater, an admiral of fortune, a commander whose word held weight like iron. His first act of leadership set the tone. Howell Davis, the man who had dragged Roberts unwillingly into piracy, had been cut down in an ambush by Portuguese soldiers on the island of Principe. Roberts, though new to the life, wasted no time in seeking revenge. He led his men back to the island and in a daring strike attacked Portuguese shipping near the harbour. The raid was successful, a bold and bloody message that no slight against Roberts' crew would go unanswered. For his men, this was proof that their choice had been wise. Roberts, the reluctant sailor, had the courage of a seasoned leader. From that moment forward, he never looked back. Roberts embraced the life of piracy, not with reckless abandon, but with a cold and calculated efficiency. Where Blackbeard had relied on smoke and fury, Roberts relied on discipline, planning, and precision. His raids were swift, his orders clear, and his results undeniable. What made him stand out was his uncanny ability to inspire confidence. Many pirate crews were fractious, prone to quarrels, mutinies, and drunken brawls. Yet under Roberts, such chaos was rare. He carried himself with a sense of dignity unusual for a pirate captain. He dressed in fine crimson coats, sometimes adorned with feathers in his hat, and wore a silver cross around his neck. To his men, this was not vanity, it was symbolism. Their captain looked every bit the commander of a fleet, and his appearance reinforced his authority. Roberts also had the gift of charisma. He was not a tyrant who ruled through cruelty, but neither was he lenient. He listened to his men, consulted them in major decisions, and upheld the pirate tradition of shared plunder. Yet once a course was decided, his orders were to be obeyed without question. The balance he struck between democracy and discipline made him both respected and feared. The results were astonishing.
Within months of his election, Roberts had transformed a ragtag crew into a formidable force. He struck boldly along the African coast, seizing ships laden with gold and goods. His raids extended into the Caribbean, where he captured merchantmen and even men of war. Each success brought more recruits, swelling his numbers and cementing his reputation. By the early 1720s, Roberts commanded a fleet of ships and hundreds of men. He was no longer simply a pirate. He was the closest thing piracy had to an admiral. His tactics reflected this. Where other captains preferred single opportunistic strikes, Roberts planned coordinated operations. He blockaded harbors, captured convoys, and raided with military precision. He moved swiftly, striking before word of his presence could spread, and vanished just as quickly, leaving terror in his wake. His men admired his bravery as much as his cunning. Roberts was known to lead from the front, the first to charge into battle, pistols blazing and cutlass raised. He did not hide behind his crew or bark orders from safety. He fought alongside them, shoulder to shoulder. This earned him immense loyalty. To sail with Roberts was to sail with a captain who shared your risks as well as your rewards.
But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how quickly he adapted. Only a year before, Roberts had been a respectable sailor, pressed into piracy against his will. Now, he was the most feared man on the Atlantic. His rise was meteoric, his legend spreading from Africa to the Americas. Captains whispered his name in dread, merchants cursed him, and sailors, whether they hated or admired him, could not deny that Roberts was something extraordinary. And yet, he remained a man of contradictions. He did not drink heavily, as so many pirates did. He forbade gambling aboard his ship. He imposed strict rules, unlike the freewheeling chaos of other crews. Some might have expected his men to rebel against such restrictions, but they didn't, because Roberts always delivered. Under his command, the crew grew rich, victories piled up, and their confidence soared. Discipline, it turned out, was no enemy of piracy. When paired with success, it was its greatest ally. By the time Roberts had fully established himself, he was no longer simply the reluctant sailor forced into piracy. He had embraced the role completely, reshaping it in his own image. He was no pirate king of theatrics like Blackbeard, but something sharper, a gentleman admiral of the Black Flag, a commander who wove discipline and daring into an unstoppable force. For his crew, those were heady days. To sail with Roberts was to live with the exhilarating certainty that, wherever they went, victory and plunder would follow. Few men in history rose so far, so fast from such reluctant beginnings. Roberts had not only become a pirate, he had become the very model of what a pirate captain could be. If Blackbeard ruled by fear and theatrics, then Bartholomew Roberts ruled by rules. To sail with him was to live under one of the strictest pirate codes ever enforced. It was a strange paradox. Aboard the ship of a man outside the law, law itself was everywhere. And while many pirates gloried in chaos and indulgence, Roberts made it clear, on his decks, order was survival. The Articles of Agreement, as pirate codes were called, were common enough. Crews used them to regulate pay, punishments, and conduct. But Roberts' code went further. Where other captains allowed drunken brawls, he forbade drinking on duty. Where others indulged in dice and cards, Roberts outlawed gambling entirely. And where most pirate ships roared with music and laughter at all hours, Roberts demanded lights out by 8 o'clock. At first glance, these rules might have seemed joyless. After all, piracy was supposed to be about freedom, the rejection of navy discipline, the rejection of merchant drudgery. But Roberts understood something few others did. A pirate crew was only as strong as its discipline, and discipline meant survival. Life aboard his flagship reflected this philosophy. The decks were kept cleaner than most, weapons were always ready for action, and watches were carefully maintained. Men who shirked duty found themselves punished swiftly, sometimes with lashes,
sometimes with loss of plunder shares. Roberts had no patience for idleness or disorder. His men joked that he ran his ships like a naval admiral, and in many ways he did. And yet there was fairness too. The plunder was divided equally according to rank, and those who were injured received compensation. If a man lost a limb, he was given more than coin. He was given the security of knowing his comrades would not abandon him. Roberts' code was strict, but it was not cruel. He understood that loyalty was forged not only in fear, but in fairness. Daily life under Roberts was more orderly than most pirate crews could imagine. Men rose at dawn to the boatswain's whistle, set to work repairing sails, swabbing decks, or manning the pumps. Meals were plain but reliable: salted meat, ship's biscuit, and the occasional fresh catch. Grog was rationed, but Roberts never let it flow to the point of disorder. When dusk came, lanterns were extinguished, and men turned into hammocks strung shoulder to shoulder. For new recruits, the adjustment could be difficult. Many came from ships where rum was drunk freely, fights were common, and authority weak. Under Roberts, they found something different, a strange blend of freedom and military rigor. Yet most adapted quickly, because the results spoke for themselves. Roberts' men lived longer, fought better, and captured more ships than any other crew. But the code was not only about discipline, it was about identity. Roberts made it clear that his crew was different, sharper, and superior to other pirates. While others wasted their spoils on drink and debauchery, Roberts's men marched with pride. They knew they sailed with the most successful captain alive, and his rules gave them a sense of belonging. Still, not everyone approved. There are accounts of discontent among those who longed for the wilder freedoms of piracy. Roberts had little patience for them. Mutiny was not tolerated, and he dealt with dissent quickly. His reputation was such that even whispers of rebellion rarely grew louder. His charisma, combined with his success, kept men in line. Roberts himself set the example. He dressed elegantly in crimson coats, sometimes with feathers in his hat, but he was no idle figurehead. He worked as hard as his men, fought at their side, and navigated with precision. He wore his silver cross openly, and while few pirates were devout, they respected his convictions. He showed them that piracy could be something greater than chaos, that it could be an enterprise, guided by order, sharpened by discipline, and crowned with victory. What was it like, then, to live under Black Bart's code? For some, it must have been frustrating. No dice games to pass the time, no wild nights of drinking, no indulgence in the chaos that defined so many other crews. But for others, it was liberating. They could trust that their captain cared for their survival as much as their plunder. They could sleep knowing that no drunken brawl would end with a knife in their gut. They could fight knowing their ship was always ready, their weapons always sharp, and their comrades always disciplined. It was not freedom in the reckless sense. It was freedom within order. And in that order, Roberts forged the deadliest pirate crew the world had ever seen. To sail with him was not to live as a rabble, but as a brotherhood bound by rules, discipline, and the iron will of a captain who understood that piracy could only thrive if it was stronger, sharper, and smarter than the world that hunted it. If Bartholomew Roberts was strict aboard his ship, he was terrifying when he unleashed his crew upon the sea. Under his command, piracy was not reckless chaos. It was a campaign, swift and relentless, striking terror wherever his black flags appeared. To sail with Roberts was to sail with a man who captured more ships than any other pirate in history, over 400 prizes in just 3 short years. His genius lay in speed and precision. Where other pirates lingered in one region, Roberts moved constantly, his sails appearing in waters from Africa to the Caribbean to South America. His raids were carefully chosen, his strikes planned like a general's. He did not simply stumble upon ships, he hunted them. And when he attacked, his men moved with the discipline of soldiers. Imagine being a merchant captain in 1720, your ship laden with sugar, rum, or gold. Suddenly, sails appear on the horizon. You see the dreaded black flag rise, signaling no quarter if you resist. Then Roberts's ship closes in. His cannons thunder, smoke fills the air, and within minutes your vessel is overwhelmed. Resistance is futile. Many surrendered without a shot fired, knowing Roberts's reputation. His most spectacular raids became legend. Off the coast of Brazil, Roberts once captured an entire convoy of 42 Portuguese ships. The sight of his fleet swooping down upon so many vessels at once must have been overwhelming, like a storm breaking across the sea. In the Caribbean, he burned and plundered without mercy, seizing valuable cargo and sending shockwaves through colonial governors. Along the West African coast, he became a scourge, capturing ships laden with goods and enslaved people, his sails striking terror from Senegal to Ghana.
The wealth he amassed was staggering. Gold coins, silver plate, fine silks, and barrels of rum poured into his coffers. His flagship was said to gleam with captured finery, flags taken as trophies, instruments, and luxuries rarely seen aboard pirate vessels. His men grew rich, their purses heavy with coin, their confidence swelling with every victory. Under Roberts, piracy was not a gamble. It was a certainty. But wealth was not the only reward. Fear itself became a weapon. Word spread across the seas of Roberts' ruthlessness in battle and his strict discipline. Merchant sailors dreaded his name, and many surrendered without a fight. Even naval commanders knew him to be dangerous, for his men fought with precision, and his tactics rivaled those of professional admirals. Yet Roberts was not needlessly cruel. He did not revel in slaughter for its own sake. Violence was a tool, not a pleasure. When it served his purpose, he showed mercy, allowing surrendered crews to live. But when provoked or resisted, his fury was swift and uncompromising. There are accounts of him hanging entire crews to make examples, his black flags promising no forgiveness to those who dared oppose him. His men understood the logic. Mercy was shown when it strengthened fear, and terror was unleashed when it preserved order. To sail with Roberts during his great campaigns was to ride a wave of triumph. His men boasted that no fleet could match them, no governor could stop them. When his sails appeared on the horizon, even the bravest hearts quailed. And for the crew, the plunder was only part of the reward. The real treasure was the sense of invincibility, of belonging to the most successful pirate fleet the world had ever seen. But victory had its dangers. The more Roberts plundered, the more determined the world became to stop him. Governors sent warships, convoys sailed under heavier guard, and the Royal Navy grew restless. For now, though, Roberts remained untouchable, his movements too swift, his tactics too sharp. The raids continued, each more daring than the last. From the harbours of the Caribbean to the trading posts of West Africa, Roberts's black flag struck fear like a plague. His men followed him eagerly, certain that each voyage would bring not only riches, but glory. They were not the rabble of a drunken pirate band. They were the crew of an admiral, a disciplined brotherhood united under a captain who never seemed to lose. To the outside world, Roberts was a monster. To his crew, he was a master. And in those heady days of conquest, it seemed as though nothing on earth or sea could stand against Black Bart Roberts. Not all pirates were remembered for their brutality. Some, like Bartholomew Roberts, were remembered just as much for their style. While other captains staggered ashore in rags, their faces red from rum, Roberts carried himself with the elegance of a nobleman. To sail with him was to follow not just a captain, but a man who looked and behaved like a gentleman, even as he terrorized the seas. Roberts was striking in appearance. He often wore a rich crimson coat, trimmed with gold, and a fine feathered hat. Around his neck hung a silver cross, gleaming in the sun, as if to remind both friend and foe that this pirate captain still clung to a sense of faith. He was tall, dark-haired, and carried himself with an unmistakable air of command. In every way, he looked less like a pirate and more like an admiral, or even a nobleman, playing the part of a rogue. But his refinement was not just for show. Roberts cultivated this image deliberately, as carefully as Blackbeard had cultivated his smoky, demonic appearance. Where Blackbeard used terror to unnerve his enemies, Roberts used charisma to command respect. To his crew, his elegance reinforced his authority. To outsiders, it blurred the line between villain and gentleman. In port, Roberts was known for his manners. He spoke politely, entertained allies with dignity, and often impressed even his enemies with his composure. While other pirates brawled in taverns, Roberts dined with finesse. And yet, there was always danger beneath the mask. His charm could turn to steel in an instant if crossed. Those who underestimated him quickly learned that beneath the fine coat beat the heart of a ruthless strategist. This contradiction fascinated his men. On one hand, Roberts enforced strict discipline. No gambling, no drunken chaos, no disorder. On the other hand, he embodied the freedom and boldness of piracy. He showed them that one could live as both a rebel and a gentleman, a commander outside the law, but still carrying the grace of one who belonged to higher ranks of society. There was also his deep sense of faith. Unusual among pirates, Roberts was known to attend church services when possible, and he wore his cross proudly even in battle. He was no saint. He plundered mercilessly after all, but he carried his beliefs with him. Some said this made him even more dangerous, a man who believed he was guided by a higher purpose, even as he defied earthly law. His refinement extended to his fleet as well. Roberts demanded his ships be maintained with care, his flags flown proudly, and his men presented as disciplined warriors rather than rabble. His black flags bore distinctive designs, sometimes a skeleton holding an hourglass, sometimes Roberts himself standing with a flaming sword. These banners, fluttering above his ships, combined terror with artistry, signaling not just death, but style. And yet, despite all this polish, Roberts never forgot his purpose. He was, above all, a pirate, and his gentlemanly exterior masked a core of cold steel. He could order executions without flinching, burn towns when resisted, and fight battles with unrelenting fury. His elegance did not soften him, it sharpened him, giving him an aura that set him apart from every other pirate captain. For his crew, this duality was both inspiring and intimidating. They sailed under a man who demanded discipline but rewarded loyalty, who looked like a nobleman but lived like an outlaw, who could dine with elegance one evening and lead them into cannon fire the next morning. Roberts showed them that piracy could be more than chaos. It could be power, refined and unstoppable. To the world beyond, this image of the gentleman pirate cemented his legend. Merchants cursed him, governors feared him, and sailors spoke of him with awe. He was not a demon like Blackbeard, nor a madman like Charles Vane. He was something rarer. He was a pirate who commanded not just fear, but respect. And perhaps that was his greatest mask. Behind the crimson coat, the silver cross, and the polished manners, Roberts was still a man who lived by plunder and violence. Yet by dressing himself in refinement, he elevated piracy into something larger, something unforgettable. To sail with Black Bart was to witness this contradiction every day. A man who was both outlaw and gentleman, ruthless and refined, devout and deadly. It was this paradox that made him not only the most successful pirate, but one of the most enduring figures of the Golden Age of Piracy. Every pirate story ends the same way, in chains, on a noose, or in battle. For Bartholomew Roberts, it was battle. After 3 years of unmatched success, after more than 400 ships had fallen to his fleet, the world finally decided that enough was enough. The Royal Navy came for him, and though Roberts had outwitted them countless times before, this time fate would not be denied. It was February 1722, off the coast of West Africa. Roberts was anchored near Cape Lopez in present-day Gabon.
His ships had been raiding along the coast, seizing prizes and terrorizing trade. But word of his presence had reached Commodore Challoner Ogle, commander of the Royal Navy warship HMS Swallow. Unlike so many merchant captains, Ogle was determined not to flee, but to hunt the gentleman pirate down. The morning of February 10th dawned hot and hazy. Roberts was dressed as he always was, elegant and commanding, in a crimson coat with a feathered hat, pistols across his chest, and his silver cross gleaming at his throat. His men were relaxed, unaware of the trap closing in around them. Then sails appeared on the horizon. At first, they thought it was another merchantman ripe for plunder. But this was no ordinary prize. It was the Swallow, a fully armed warship. Roberts did not panic. He had faced danger before, and his confidence had carried him through countless battles. He ordered his men to prepare for action. His flagship, the Royal Fortune, turned to face the enemy. Cannons were loaded, muskets primed, cutlasses sharpened. The black flag of Roberts was raised, defiant against the British ensign. The battle that followed was fierce and brief. The Swallow unleashed a devastating broadside, its heavy guns tearing through the rigging and hull of the Royal Fortune. Splinters flew like deadly arrows, men were cut down where they stood, and chaos erupted on deck. Still, Roberts stood tall, refusing to retreat. He strode the deck in full view of his men, a figure of calm amid the storm of fire and smoke. Then came the fatal moment. A musket ball struck Roberts in the throat. He staggered, blood staining his fine crimson coat. For an instant, his men froze in shock. But Roberts had prepared for this. He had ordered long before that, should he ever fall in battle, his body was not to be taken by the enemy. And so, as the life drained from him, his men carried out his final command. They threw his body overboard, into the waters of the Atlantic, where the sea claimed him before the British could. With their captain gone, the fight quickly collapsed. The Royal Fortune was overpowered, its men captured. More than 200 of Roberts' crew were taken prisoner. Many were hanged in the weeks that followed, their bodies displayed as grim warnings along the coast. The Golden Age of Piracy was already waning, and with Roberts' death, it lost one of its last greatest figures. For his men, it was the end of their invincibility. For the world, it was the end of the most successful pirate in history. No one before or since matched his record. Over 400 ships captured, dozens of ports raided, and countless fortunes plundered. Roberts had turned piracy from reckless chaos into something closer to naval warfare, and in doing so, he left a mark that could never be erased.
And yet, his legacy was not only one of fear. To many sailors, Roberts symbolized a strange kind of order and justice within piracy. He enforced rules, protected his men with fair shares, and carried himself with dignity. He showed that a pirate captain could be more than a drunken cutthroat, that he could be disciplined, commanding, and even gentlemanly. Stories of his final battle spread quickly across the Atlantic. Sailors told of his crimson coat, his silver cross, and how he had faced death without flinching. Even his enemies admitted his courage. And as with Blackbeard before him, the legend only grew. Roberts became the model of the pirate admiral, the gentleman pirate who lived with style, fought with discipline, and died on his feet. To sail with Bartholomew Roberts, his men would later recall, was to sail with a man who seemed born to command. He was not reckless, but bold, not cruel, but uncompromising, not chaotic, but disciplined. And though his reign was short, it was dazzling, a flash of brilliance in the stormy twilight of piracy's golden age. When his body slipped beneath the waves, the sea claimed not just a man, but a legend. His name lived on in ballads, broadsheets, and whispers in taverns. Even today, when we think of pirates, the shadow of Black Bart sails with them, a crimson figure against the horizon, a gentleman among rogues, and the greatest captain of them all. And so,
Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, slipped beneath the waves, his crimson coat and silver cross vanishing into the Atlantic. He was the reluctant sailor who became the most successful pirate in history, the man who captured more than 400 ships, and the gentleman pirate who proved that discipline and order could be as deadly as cannon fire. But Roberts's death was also a turning point. The Golden Age of Piracy was nearing its end, and the days of pirate admirals ruling the seas were fading fast. Yet for a few short years he showed the world what piracy could be: efficient, terrifying, and unstoppable. Now, I want to hear from you. If you had to choose, would you rather sail with Blackbeard's chaos and fury, or Roberts's discipline and precision? Tell me in the comments below. I'll be reading your answers as I prepare the next story. Because our voyage doesn't end here. Next time we'll dive into the life of Captain William Kidd, a man remembered by some as a ruthless pirate, and by others as a victim of circumstance, hanged for crimes he may not have committed. Was Kidd truly a villain, or was he a scapegoat of empire? That's the mystery we'll unravel together. Until then, thank you for joining me on this journey. May your dreams tonight be filled with calm seas, the whisper of sails, and the shadow of a crimson figure on the horizon.
Chapter 3. William Kidd.
When you think of pirates, certain images come to mind: skull and crossbones flags, cutlasses flashing in the sun, treasure chests overflowing with gold. But for centuries, one pirate has stood apart, not because of the ships he burned or the riches he plundered, but because of the mystery that still surrounds his name: Captain William Kidd. Unlike Blackbeard, who thrived on terror, or Bartholomew Roberts, who ruled with discipline, William Kidd's story is a puzzle. Was he a pirate at all, or was he the victim of betrayal, a scapegoat sacrificed to politics? His legend has endured not just because of what he did, but because of what we don't know for certain. And of course, because of the whispered tales of buried treasure that have sent treasure hunters digging along coasts for over 300 years. Imagine yourself in the late 1600s, a time when the seas were alive with privateers, men licensed by governments to attack enemy ships in times of war. William Kidd was one of them, a Scottish sailor with a sharp mind and a steady hand. He wasn't a rabble-rouser or a drunkard. He was respected, even admired. Governors and noblemen trusted him. Merchants hired him to protect their ships. And in 1696, he was given one of the most prestigious commands of the era, a commission from the King of England himself to hunt down pirates in the Indian Ocean. It should have been the chance of a lifetime. Kidd set sail aboard his ship, the Adventure Galley, with the law on his side and the promise of glory ahead. But the voyage quickly turned dark. The Indian Ocean was vast, and legitimate pirate targets were few. Months dragged on with no success, his crew growing restless, their bellies empty and their pay uncertain. Discipline frayed, rumors spread, and slowly the line between privateer and pirate began to blur. The moment of no return came when Kidd captured a richly laden vessel, the Quedar Merchant. To his crew, it was the prize they had been waiting for: wealth beyond measure, silks, gold, and jewels spilling from the holds. To Kidd, it was complicated. The ship flew the French flag, making it, in his eyes, a legal prize. But the vessel also had ties to powerful English interests, and his enemies would later use it against him. When Kidd finally returned to England, hoping to clear his name, he found no honor, no reward, only betrayal. His backers abandoned him, politicians needed a scapegoat, and the once respected captain was thrown in chains. At his trial, evidence was twisted, and his pleas ignored. In 1701, William Kidd was hanged at Execution Dock, his body left to rot in chains above the Thames as a warning to all who might turn pirate. And yet, his story did not die with him. Instead, it grew. Whispers spread of treasure buried in secret coves, hidden on remote islands, cached along the American coast. For centuries, adventurers dug into sandy beaches and jungle clearings, chasing the ghost of Captain Kidd's fortune. Even today, the name Kidd conjures up images of maps marked with X's and treasure chests waiting to be unearthed. Tonight, we'll uncover what it was really like to sail with Captain William Kidd. We'll see how a respected sailor became branded a pirate, how his crew lived aboard the adventure galley, and how a single ship, the Quedar merchant, sealed his fate. We'll follow his fall from grace, his execution, and the legend of treasure that outlived him. So settle in, and let the waves carry you back to an age when the line between pirate and privateer was razor thin, when betrayal was never far from loyalty, and when one man's name became forever bound to the mysteries of the sea. This is the story of Captain William Kidd.
William Kidd's story begins far from the roaring cannons and glittering prizes of piracy. He was born around 1645 in Dundee, Scotland, to a humble family. Little is known about his childhood, but it was a world shaped by the sea. Scotland's coasts were dotted with fishing villages and trading harbours, and for ambitious young men, the ocean offered a chance at fortune, or at least survival. Kidd chose the sea not as a rogue, but as a profession. By the time he reached adulthood, Kidd was an experienced sailor, skilled in navigation and ship handling. He wasn't a reckless adventurer, but a man who earned respect for his discipline and reliability. He soon found himself in the New World, settling in New York City, a bustling port where merchants, governors, and privateers all rubbed shoulders. It was here that Kidd began to build his reputation, not as a pirate, but as a man of substance and reliability. In 1689, as England and France clashed in the 9 Years' War, Kidd's career took a fateful turn. Privateering, essentially legalized piracy, was in full swing. Kings and governors issued letters of marque, licenses that allowed captains to attack enemy ships and keep part of the spoils. Kidd was among those who took up the mantle. Commanding a small ship called the Blessed William, he captured French vessels in the Caribbean, earning both profit and prestige. His men admired his steady leadership, and colonial governors respected him as a loyal servant of the crown.
But Kidd was no ordinary privateer. He had a knack for navigating the treacherous waters of politics as well as the open sea. In 1691, he married Sarah Bradley Cox Ort, a wealthy New York widow, cementing his place among the city's elite. He became a man of means, rubbing shoulders with merchants, landowners, and politicians. This was no drunken sea dog. Kidd was polished, ambitious, and increasingly influential. His reputation grew further when, in 1695, he was commissioned by the governor of New York to deliver supplies to the Caribbean. During this voyage, his crew captured a French ship and boldly renamed it the Blessed William. It was a small act, but one that demonstrated Kidd's confidence and authority. The real turning point came in 1696. Kidd returned to London, where he secured a commission that would define his destiny. Backed by powerful patrons, including noblemen and even members of Parliament, he was tasked with a prestigious mission to hunt down pirates in the Indian Ocean and protect English commerce from French aggression. To fulfill this mission, Kidd was given command of a formidable new ship, the Adventure Galley. This vessel was built for both speed and power, armed with 34 cannons and equipped with both sails and oars, allowing her to maneuver even in calm seas. She was a hybrid, a predator designed to chase down pirates and enemy traders alike. For Kidd, it was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to cement his legacy as a hero of empire. The Adventure Galley was not just a ship, it was a symbol of trust. The English crown and its investors placed immense faith in Kidd. He was expected to safeguard English trade, punish pirates, and bring home rich prizes. Success would make him a legend. failure would be unthinkable. As preparations for the voyage began, Kidd faced the task of recruiting a crew. He gathered sailors from London's docks, hardened men eager for plunder, but not always loyal. Many were rough characters, accustomed to piracy rather than service under a disciplined captain. This would prove a fateful mix, for Kidd's mission required order, but his crew hungered for fortune above all else. In these early days, however, optimism reigned. Kidd cut a fine figure in London society, attending gatherings of his patrons, dining with noblemen, and boasting of the riches he would bring back. He was no outlaw skulking in shadows. He was a respected commander, admired for his ambition and composure. And yet, as his men filed aboard the adventure galley in 1696, the seeds of his downfall were already sown. Kidd was caught between two worlds, the world of law, where his commission gave him legitimacy, and the world of the sea, where discipline could crumble under the hunger for gold. For now, though, all seemed bright. William Kidd, the Scottish sailor who had risen from humble beginnings to command one of the most advanced ships of his day, was about to embark on the voyage that would make, or break, his name forever. In 1696, William Kidd stood on the deck of the adventure galley, ready to begin the greatest voyage of his life. The ship gleamed with promise. 34 cannons lined her decks, oars for maneuvering in calm seas, and a design that made her as fast as she was deadly. She was the perfect hunter, built to chase pirates across oceans. For Kidd, it must have felt like destiny. He had wealth, he had patrons, and he had the law on his side. What could go wrong? But the sea, as always, had its own plans. The voyage began with promise. Kidd set sail from London with a crew of about 150 men, hardened sailors drawn from the taverns and wharves of the city. Many of them were already leaning toward piracy, men with little patience for discipline. They joined Kidd, not out of loyalty to the crown, but in the hope of capturing rich prizes. Kidd, however, still believed in his mission. He was determined to stay within the law, to capture only French ships and confirmed pirates. Almost immediately, though, trouble began. As the adventure galley sailed down the Thames, Kidd angered the Royal Navy by refusing to salute a Navy ship. It may have been pride, or it may have been carelessness, but the Navy officers were insulted. To Kidd, it seemed a minor slight. To the Navy, it was an early sign that he was reckless, perhaps even arrogant. Crossing the Atlantic, the voyage grew more difficult. Supplies dwindled, tempers flared, and Kidd's crew began to grumble. For men who had signed on expecting plunder, weeks of uneventful sailing were intolerable. They muttered that Kidd was too cautious, too bound by law, unwilling to seize opportunities. Where they wanted gold, Kidd demanded restraint. When the adventure galley reached the Cape of Good Hope and pressed on toward the Indian Ocean, the strain deepened. The seas were vast, the targets few. Kidd searched for pirates and French prizes, but days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and still nothing came. The crew's pay depended on plunder, and with every empty day, resentment grew sharper. Discipline began to fray. Sailors skipped duties. Arguments flared into brawls, and whispers of mutiny spread. Kidd tried to hold the line, but his authority was tested again and again. In one infamous incident, he quarreled with his gunner, William Moore, who urged him to attack a ship flying neutral colors. Kidd refused, arguing that the ship was not a legal prize. In fury, he struck Moore with an iron-bound bucket. The blow killed him. It was a shocking moment. Captain Kidd, who had sworn to uphold law and order, had taken a man's life with his own hand. For his crew, it was proof that their captain was slipping. Still, the voyage pressed on. Kidd was desperate to find success, to prove himself to his backers and silence his restless crew. The adventure galley roamed the Indian Ocean, from Madagascar to the Red Sea, hunting for targets. There were near misses, ships that escaped, and false hopes that turned to nothing. Each disappointment deepened the anger aboard. By now, Kidd was trapped in an impossible position. His patrons in England expected prizes, proof of his worth, and profit for their investment. His crew demanded plunder, gold to fill their pockets and justify their suffering. And yet, the legal boundaries of his commission kept him from attacking any ship that was not French or pirate. Each day of failure pulled him closer to the line between law and outlaw. It was in this crucible of frustration that fate presented him with the opportunity and the curse that would define his life. The Quedagh Merchant. By 1698, frustration weighed heavy on the adventure galley. The Indian Ocean had yielded almost nothing. Months of sailing, endless hunger, and bitter tempers left Kidd's crew restless and mutinous. They had signed on with dreams of riches. Instead, they had endured storms, shortages, and near starvation. Each day without plunder was another strike against their captain. Then, on January 30th, fate brought them a ship that would change everything, the Quedagh Merchant. The vessel was magnificent. Laden with silks, gold, sugar, opium, and other riches, she was one of the wealthiest prizes anyone could hope for. Her holds overflowed with treasure. For Kidd's desperate men, the sight must have been dazzling. After months of disappointment, here at last was fortune. But the situation was not simple. The Quedagh Merchant flew French colors, which should have made her a legal prize. Yet the ship was commanded by an English captain and owned by powerful Armenian merchants, many of whom had ties to the English East India Company. To Kidd, it was a tangle of risk and opportunity. Seizing her could mean riches beyond imagining, but it could also mean accusations of piracy. The crew, however, cared little for such legalities. They demanded action. After months of empty hands, they were ready to mutiny if Kidd hesitated. In that moment, Kidd faced an impossible choice: cling to the law and risk losing his men, or seize the ship and risk losing his reputation. Kidd chose the latter. The capture was swift. The adventure galley closed in, cannons ready, but the Quedagh Merchant offered little resistance. Kidd's men swarmed aboard, overwhelmed the crew, and claimed the ship as their own. The holds glittered with wealth: silks, spices, jewels, and gold enough to satisfy even the hungriest pirate. To the crew, it was victory at last. To Kidd, it was the beginning of the end. In his mind, he could still justify it. The French flag made the ship a legitimate prize under his commission. He believed he could defend his actions before the law, but his enemies would see it differently. The powerful interests tied to the Quedagh Merchant would not forgive its loss, and Kidd's backers in England, already nervous about his lack of success, would soon turn against him. For now, though, the crew celebrated. The wealth of the Quedagh Merchant was beyond anything they had imagined. Chests of treasure were hauled onto the adventure galley, while Kidd appointed a prize crew to sail the captured ship. Spirits soared, and for the first time in months, the men cheered their captain instead of cursing him. Yet even in victory, shadows loomed. The killing of William Moore still haunted the crew. Whispers spread that Kidd was cursed, that nothing good would come of their plunder. The more cautious sailors muttered that seizing the Quedagh Merchant was folly, that the East India Company would brand them pirates. And as word of the capture spread across the seas, Kidd's name began to change. No longer the respected privateer, he was now called what he most dreaded: pirate. The decision weighed heavily on him. Kidd knew the stakes. He was no fool. He understood the reach of his enemies and the power of politics. But he also knew that turning back empty-handed would mean ruin. He gambled that he could argue his case, present the French papers as proof of legality, and convince his patrons that he had acted within the law. It was a gamble that would cost him everything. In that moment, aboard the glittering prize of the Quedagh Merchant, William Kidd crossed the line. Whether by choice or by force of circumstance, he stepped into the world of piracy. And though he may have believed himself still a privateer, the world would never see him that way again. The capture of the Quedar merchant should have been the crowning achievement of William Kidd's career. Her holds brimmed with riches, silks, gold, sugar, spices and jewels, wealth enough to make his entire voyage worthwhile. For a brief, shining moment, Kidd's men rejoiced. They toasted their captain, pockets jingling with newfound treasure, their resentment washed away in the glow of plunder. But fortune is a fickle mistress, and for Kidd, the prize carried more danger than reward. At first, he tried to convince himself he had acted lawfully. The ship had flown French colours after all, and under the terms of his commission, that made her a legitimate target. Kidd even produced papers captured aboard the vessel that seemed to confirm her French associations. But the truth was murkier. The ship's captain was English, and her owners were powerful Armenian merchants with strong ties to the East India Company. They were not pirates. They were not enemies. And they were well connected enough to ensure that news of their loss would cause outrage. The crew, however, did not care for such subtleties. They revelled in their prize, and for them, Kidd had finally proven himself worthy. Their loyalty returned, at least for a time, as they sailed under the weight of treasure. Yet even among his men, doubt lingered. They knew the East India Company was a giant, an empire unto itself, and that seizing its friends' property was a dangerous game. Kidd, ever the cautious strategist, realized this too. He knew he would face questions when he returned to England, and he began preparing his defense. He collected the French passes, carefully preserved them, and rehearsed the argument he would make, that he had acted under his commission, that the prize was legal, and that he was still a loyal servant of the crown. But across the seas, whispers were spreading faster than his defences could travel. Word of the capture reached colonial governors and East India Company officials. To them, Kidd was not a hero, but a rogue who had betrayed his mission. Merchants wailed that their fortunes had been stolen, and politicians, always eager for a scapegoat, began to see in Kidd a convenient villain. The situation worsened as Kidd's voyage dragged on. The adventure galley, already worn from years of service, was falling apart. Leaks sprang, sails tore, and the once proud ship began to rot. To make matters worse, disease spread among the crew. Scurvy, fever, and hunger claimed lives, and the men's loyalty once again wavered. Desperate, Kidd made the fateful decision to burn the adventure galley and transfer his command to the captured Quedar merchant. She was renamed the Adventure Prize, a cruel irony, for while she promised fortune, she carried Kidd deeper into ruin. With her, he sailed back across the seas toward the New World, hoping to find safe harbor and eventually return to England with his case. But by then, the tide had turned irrevocably. News of his piracy had reached London. His patrons, once eager for his success, now abandoned him. The East India Company demanded justice. Even King William distanced himself from the man he had once commissioned. Kidd's name, once spoken with respect, was now whispered with scorn. When Kidd finally reached the Caribbean, he was already branded a pirate in the eyes of the world. Governors closed their ports to him. Colonial officials refused him refuge. He was hunted, not welcomed. Everywhere he turned, the net drew tighter. For his men, the dream of fortune soured. Many deserted, slipping away into the anonymity of colonial towns. Others turned openly against him, eager to save their own necks when the law closed in. And all the while, Kidd clung to the hope that he could still prove his innocence, that his papers, his arguments, and his record as a privateer would save him. But the truth was plain. Kidd's capture of the Quedar merchant had set forces in motion beyond his control. He was no longer a privateer. In the eyes of the Crown, the East India Company, and the Royal Navy, he was a pirate. And so the treasure that should have secured his glory instead secured his downfall. It was wealth enough to tempt kings, but poisoned wealth, cursed wealth, the kind that carried not fortune, but doom. By the time William Kidd returned to the Atlantic world, the tide of fortune had turned completely against him. His capture of the Quedar merchant had made him rich, but it had also made him infamous. In London, pamphlets whispered of Kidd's treachery, merchants demanded vengeance, and politicians, eager to protect their own reputations, pointed to Kidd as the perfect scapegoat. Kidd, still clinging to the belief in his own innocence, sailed to the Caribbean. He hoped to find allies there, governors who had once respected him. Instead, he found only closed doors. Colonial officials, wary of being seen as sympathetic to a pirate, refused him entry. Some pretended neutrality, but most knew that Kidd was already marked for capture. His name was poison. Worse still, his crew was dissolving. Many deserted, taking what treasure they could and vanishing into the anonymity of colonial ports. Others betrayed him, spreading tales of his supposed villainy to curry favor with the authorities. The man who had once been a respected privateer now found himself isolated, abandoned, and hounded across the seas. In desperation, Kidd sailed north toward New York, the city that had once embraced him as one of its own. He still had friends there, men of influence, who he believed might help him present his case. In 1699, he secretly buried some of his treasure on Gardiner's Island, off the coast of Long Island. A desperate act meant to safeguard his wealth until he could clear his name. That treasure would later become the root of centuries of legends, but for Kidd, it was not myth. It was a lifeline. Eventually, Kidd surrendered himself in Boston, hoping to negotiate his way out of disaster. He trusted that his powerful patrons in England, the very men who had financed his voyage, would protect him. But he was wrong. His backers were themselves under scrutiny, accused of shady dealings and corruption. To save themselves, they abandoned Kidd, painting him as the sole villain. He was shipped to London in chains, where he was thrown into the cold, damp cells of Newgate Prison. There he languished for months, awaiting a trial that would seal his fate. When the day finally came, it was not justice he found, but politics. At his trial in 1701, the odds were stacked against him. Evidence was manipulated, testimonies twisted, and his French passes, the very documents that might have proved the legality of the Quedar merchant capture, were conveniently mislaid until after the verdict. Kidd argued passionately that he had acted within his commission, that he had never sought to be a pirate, and that he was the victim of betrayal. But his words fell on deaf ears. The verdict was swift, guilty of piracy and murder. The murder charge stemmed from the death of William Moore, the gunner Kidd had struck with a bucket years before. That single blow, born of anger and frustration, now weighed as heavily as all the treasure he had seized. On May 23, 1701, William Kidd was led to Execution Dock in London. A crowd gathered to watch, as they always did when pirates were hanged. Kidd climbed the scaffold in his crimson coat, still carrying himself with dignity. Twice the rope snapped before the deed was done, an eerie moment that some in the crowd took as a sign of divine intervention. But the third attempt held, and Captain Kidd was hanged until dead. His body was then dipped in tar, encased in an iron gibbet, and hung over the River Thames as a warning to all who might dare follow his path. For years, his corpse swayed above the water, a grim reminder of the Crown's justice. For Kidd, it was the end. But for his legend, it was only the beginning. When Captain William Kidd swung from the gallows at Execution Dock in 1701, his body tarred and chained above the Thames, it seemed like his story had ended. But in truth, it had only just begun. For while his life ended in disgrace, his legend endured, fueled not by the ships he captured, or the trial that condemned him, but by the tantalizing whisper of buried treasure. The seeds of the myth were planted during Kidd's last days of freedom. On his way back to New York, desperate and hunted, he stopped at Gardiner's Island off the coast of Long Island. There, according to contemporary records, he buried a cache of treasure, gold coins, jewels, silks, and other valuables from his voyages. It was not legend, but fact. When Kidd was arrested, colonial authorities recovered part of this hoard and sent it to England as evidence. But the imagination of the public soon took this truth and spun it into myth. If Kidd had buried treasure once, why not many times? Where else might he have hidden his wealth? Suddenly, stories spread of secret caches hidden on remote islands, buried under palm trees, or sunk in coastal coves. An ordinary man might die a criminal, but Kidd had died a legend, a man who left behind riches waiting to be discovered. For centuries, treasure hunters chased this phantom fortune. On Long Island, New York, men dug holes in the sand, convinced they were close to Kidd's gold. In New England, rumors persisted that his loot lay hidden in rivers and caves. In the Caribbean, on islands like Hispaniola and St. Thomas, adventurers scoured the jungles for signs of chests marked with an X. Even Nova Scotia's Oak Island mystery has been linked by some to Kidd, though the truth remains as elusive as ever.
The irony is that Kidd himself never became fabulously wealthy. He died insisting he had never been a pirate, that his fortune was modest compared to the legends. And yet, the allure of buried treasure was too powerful to resist. Stories of Kidd's hidden hoards spread across Europe and America, inspiring books, ballads, and countless maps drawn with shaky X's that promised riches to the bold. Kidd's treasure also left its mark on culture. In the 19th century, writers like Washington Irving and Edgar Allan Poe revived the legend, weaving tales of haunted treasure and cursed gold. The very idea of a pirate burying his loot on a distant shore, so common in our modern imagination, owes much to Kidd. Before him, pirates usually spent their plunder quickly in taverns and ports. But Kidd's legend painted them as secretive hoarders, guarding gold in hidden vaults. Historians still debate how much truth lies in these stories. Some argue that Kidd buried only the one cache at Gardiner's Island, which was quickly recovered. Others suggest that, in his desperate flight from the law, he may indeed have hidden more treasure along the American coast. No conclusive evidence has ever been found, but perhaps that is why the legend endures. The mystery itself is the treasure. Today, more than 3 centuries later, William Kidd's name still conjures images of fortune buried in the sand. His story is told not only as a tale of piracy and betrayal, but as the beginning of one of the greatest myths of the sea. He was hanged as a criminal, but remembered as a pirate whose treasure may still lie waiting somewhere beneath the earth for those bold or foolish enough to seek it. And so, the man who may never have been a pirate in the truest sense became one of the most famous of them all. His reputation was destroyed by politics, his life ended in chains, but his legend lived on in the hopes and dreams of treasure hunters across the world. To sail with William Kidd, then, was to live not only the hard life of a sailor, but also to stand at the edge of history and myth. His men may have lived in hunger, fear, and mutiny, but they also became part of a story that would outlive them all. The legend of Captain Kidd's treasure, a story still whispered whenever the sea breeze rustles through palm trees, or the sand hides something just beneath the surface. And so ends the tale of Captain William Kidd, a man who began as a respected privateer, sailed under the commission of kings, and died branded a pirate. Was he truly the villain his trial proclaimed him to be, or was he a scapegoat sacrificed to politics and power? That mystery lingers still, just like the whispers of his treasure hidden somewhere along the coasts of the New World. For his crew, life aboard the adventure galley was hard. Hunger, mutiny, and uncertainty haunted every voyage. And for Kidd himself, the line between loyalty and betrayal was as thin as a strand of rope. Yet centuries later, his story remains alive.
not because of the riches he gained, but because of the legend he left behind. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Kidd really buried more treasure than the cash at Gardener's Island? Or has the world been chasing a ghost for 300 years? Drop your answer in the comments below, and be sure to stay tuned, because in our next voyage, we'll sail with one of the most unpredictable pirates of them all, Charles Vane. Wild, violent, and uncontrollable, Vane was everything Kidd was not, and his story will show us the true chaos of life under a captain who lived by fury instead of discipline. Until then, may your dreams be filled with calm seas, golden horizons, and the echo of a treasure chest waiting to be found.
Chapter 4. Charles Vane. If Blackbeard was terror and Bartholomew Roberts was discipline, then Charles Vane was something else entirely, chaos given form. Where other pirate captains balanced fear with strategy, Vane ruled by sheer brutality. He was notorious not for cunning or wealth, but for cruelty, defiance, and a temper that even his own crew couldn't control. To sail with Charles Vane was to live under constant threat, not just from the guns of the Royal Navy, but from the unpredictable wrath of your own captain. Imagine standing on the deck of a pirate ship in the Caribbean, the sun beating down, sweat dripping into your eyes as you haul ropes and load cannons. Above you, Charles Vane stalks the deck in his weathered coat, his eyes blazing, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. If a prisoner displeases him, Vane has them tortured. If a crew member talks back, Vane doesn't hesitate to mete out punishment. Loyalty isn't rewarded, and disobedience isn't tolerated. Fear keeps the crew in line, but only for so long. Vane's career began in Nassau, the infamous pirate haven in the Bahamas, a place where outlaws, smugglers, and broken men built their own society in defiance of the world's empires. There, Vane thrived. He built a reputation for bold raids, violent attacks, and a complete refusal to bend to authority. When the British Crown offered pardons to pirates in exchange for peace, Vane spat in their faces. He'd rather die a pirate than live under a king's mercy. But his pride and savagery were double-edged swords. What made him feared by his enemies also made him hated by his own crew. In the world of piracy, captains were elected, and crews could depose leaders who lost their confidence. For Vane, it was only a matter of time. His arrogance, his cruelty, and his reckless decisions pushed his men too far. And when the moment came, they turned on him. The story of Charles Vane is not one of golden treasure or cunning strategy. It's the story of a man consumed by his own rage, betrayed by his crew, and hanged as a warning to all who would follow his path. Tonight, we'll uncover what it was really like to sail under Charles Vane. We'll step into Nassau's lawless world, witness the terror of his cruelty, and follow his downfall from feared captain to hunted criminal. This is not the tale of a legend polished by time. It's the tale of raw brutality, of mutiny and betrayal, of a pirate who lived and died by chaos itself. This is the story of Charles Vane. The story of Charles Vane begins not in glory, but in shadows. Unlike Blackbeard, whose origins are at least partly traceable, or Bartholomew Roberts, who came from Wales, Charles Vane's early life is a mystery. Historians aren't sure where he was born. Some suggest England, others Ireland. But what is clear is that by the early 1700s, Vane had already carved out a reputation in the Caribbean. The first firm records of Vane appear around 1716, just as the Golden Age of Piracy was roaring into full swing. The War of the Spanish Succession had ended, leaving thousands of sailors and privateers suddenly unemployed. Men who had once fought under legitimate commissions now found themselves cast aside, with no work and no pay. Many of them turned to piracy. For someone like Vane, tough, ambitious, and ruthless, this was the perfect storm. By 1717, Vane was active around Nassau in the Bahamas,
the notorious pirate republic. Nassau was unlike any other port in the Caribbean. Once a British colony, it had effectively been abandoned by the Crown and overrun by pirates. Ships flying the black flag crowded its harbour, and its streets bustled with smugglers, traders, and fugitives. Here, there was no king, no law, no navy to enforce order. Instead, pirates governed themselves, electing their own captains and dividing plunder according to their own codes. For a man like Charles Vane, Nassau was paradise. Bold, violent, and unrestrained, he quickly made a name for himself. He joined pirate crews that raided merchant shipping lanes, striking fear into traders sailing between the colonies. Vane's skill in combat and his utter lack of mercy set him apart. Captains began to trust him with responsibility, and soon he rose from an ordinary deckhand to a trusted officer. In 1718, his fortunes rose dramatically when he became quartermaster under a pirate named Henry Jennings, one of the early leaders of Nassau's pirates. The quartermaster was second only to the captain, responsible for discipline, supplies, and ensuring the crew's share of plunder was fairly divided. It was a role that required both strength and authority, and Vane wielded both with an iron hand. When the British Crown finally turned its eyes back toward Nassau, King George I offered a general pardon to all pirates willing to give up their trade. Some, like Benjamin Hornigold, accepted the pardon and retired from piracy. Others, like Blackbeard, toyed with legitimacy before slipping back into outlaw life. But Charles Vane had no interest in compromise. To him, accepting a pardon was weakness. He mocked those who bent the knee, calling them cowards unworthy of the black flag. This refusal set Vane apart. While others laid down their arms, he grew bolder. In July of 1718, when Governor Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau to enforce British authority, Vane staged a dramatic act of defiance. Rogers's fleet entered the harbour, determined to bring the pirate republic to heel. Rather than surrender, Vane loaded a captured brigantine with explosives, set it aflame, and sent it straight into the governor's fleet. The burning ship exploded in the harbour, scattering Rogers' forces and buying Vane and his men time to escape. It was reckless, audacious, and pure Vane. From that moment on, Charles Vane was no longer just another pirate. He was infamous. He had openly defied the king's governor, spitting in the face of royal authority. His reputation spread across the Caribbean, and his name became synonymous with defiance. But Nassau also taught him another lesson. Power came from fear. Vane saw firsthand how terror could control both enemies and allies. He cultivated an image of savagery, torturing prisoners, burning ships, and leaving survivors with stories designed to spread his infamy. For Vane, cruelty wasn't just instinct, it was strategy. By making his enemies fear him more than death itself, he hoped to keep his crew loyal and his foes trembling. And for a time, it worked. Vane built a following of hardened men, outcasts who thrived on his reckless leadership. Together they prowled the seas, striking at merchant ships, capturing prizes, and spreading mayhem wherever they went. Nassau may have been under the king's rule, but Vane made the seas his kingdom. Yet even in these early years, the seeds of his downfall were visible. His brutality alienated allies, and his arrogance grated on his crew. Unlike captains such as Roberts, who balanced discipline with reward, Vane gave little thought to fairness or unity. His men feared him, but they did not respect him. And in a world where pirate crews could vote out their captains, that fear would only carry him so far. Still, in these years of blood and fire, Charles Vane's name burned brightly. He was the pirate who refused the king's pardon, the outlaw who turned a burning ship into a weapon, the captain who ruled through cruelty. To sail with Vane was to join a life of constant danger, glory for some, misery for most, and death for many. The rise of Charles Vane had begun, By the time Charles Vane had carved out his reputation in the Caribbean, one thing was clear: fear was his currency. Other captains earned loyalty through charisma or discipline, but Vane ruled by terror alone. To sail with him was to live in constant dread, whether you were an enemy, a captive, or even a member of his own crew. Accounts of Vane's cruelty spread quickly. When he captured merchant ships, he rarely showed restraint. Prisoners were beaten, sometimes tortured, and often killed. Survivors carried tales back to port towns, whispering of the pirate who seemed to take pleasure in pain. For Vane, this was part of the plan. Terror wasn't a side effect. It was his weapon. He wanted the mere mention of his name to freeze men's blood and to make ships surrender before a shot was fired. But his savagery went further than intimidation. In one incident recorded in the Caribbean, Vane captured a French vessel. Rather than simply loot the ship and release its crew, he set it ablaze, watching as the flames consumed both ship and men. It was wanton destruction, an act that horrified even his own pirates. Yet Vane laughed as the ship burned, declaring that mercy had no place at sea. Life aboard his ship reflected the same cruelty. Discipline was harsh, punishments brutal. Vane's temper was legendary. A single misstep or word of defiance could bring down his wrath. Sailors lived under constant threat of violence. Unlike captains who shared plunder generously to keep men loyal, Vane hoarded wealth for himself and rewarded favorites, deepening resentment among the rank and file. Still, there was a twisted effectiveness to his methods. Fear kept mutiny at bay, for a while. Few dared challenge him openly. His enemies, terrified by his reputation, often surrendered without a fight. And when they didn't, Vane made sure their fates served as examples. He would leave wrecked ships adrift, corpses dangling from the rigging, grim warnings to any who crossed his path. What made Vane especially dangerous was his defiance of authority. When the king's pardon was offered, many pirates accepted, hoping for a quieter life. Vane scorned the idea. To him, bending the knee was worse than death. He mocked pardoned pirates as traitors, declaring he would die with the black flag flying rather than live as a servant of the crown. This uncompromising stance won him admirers among younger, reckless pirates who craved the same lawless freedom. Yet cruelty and arrogance are a volatile mix. While fear can hold a crew together in the short term, it cannot build lasting loyalty. Even as Vane's reputation grew, his men began to grumble. They saw how other captains treated their crews with fairness, sharing plunder and consulting men on decisions. Vane offered no such balance. He demanded obedience, ruled through violence, and gave little in return. To outsiders, he was a monster of the seas. To those who sailed under him, he was a storm waiting to break. One story tells of Vane encountering a small merchant vessel. The crew begged for mercy, offering all they had. Vane took the cargo, and then set the ship on fire anyway. To his men, it was a pointless act of cruelty. To Vane, it was necessary. Better, he believed, to terrify the seas than to risk looking weak. But his greatest act of defiance came not from cruelty toward prisoners, but from his refusal to back down in the face of overwhelming odds. When confronted by warships larger than his own, Vane often chose to fight recklessly, risking the lives of his crew. He cared little for strategy if it meant surrender. This recklessness thrilled some, but alarmed many. For every daring escape, there was also unnecessary bloodshed. By 1718 and 1719, Charles Vane was infamous across the Caribbean. Merchant captains dreaded his flag. Governors cursed his name. Even other pirates watched him warily, recognizing that his savagery could bring unwanted attention from the crown. He was feared, yes, but he was also unpredictable, uncontrollable, and increasingly isolated. For those who sailed with him, the question was no longer if Vane would push too far, but when. His cruelty had built his reputation, but it had also sown the seeds of his downfall. And soon, those seeds would sprout in the unlikeliest of places, among his own crew. If there was one place where Charles Vane truly belonged, it was Nassau. Nestled in the Bahamas, this scrappy port town became the beating heart of the Golden Age of Piracy. By the 1710s, Nassau was a pirate's paradise, a safe haven beyond the reach of kings and navies, where outlaw crews gathered to drink, trade, and boast of their exploits. For Vane, Nassau was more than a refuge. It was his kingdom. The town was a lawless jumble of taverns, brothels, and warehouses, where ships flying the black flag dropped anchor side by side. Here, pirates elected their captains, divided their plunder, and forged alliances. The British Crown had abandoned Nassau years earlier, leaving it to fall under the sway of men like Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, and of course, Charles Vane. Unlike Blackbeard, who cultivated terror with theatrical flair, or Hornigold, who tried to play politics, Vane made his mark through sheer violence and defiance. He strutted through Nassau's dirt streets in his weather-beaten coat, surrounded by loyal ruffians, his very presence enough to silence taverns. Everyone knew that Vane was dangerous, quick-tempered, merciless, and unwilling to compromise. It was in Nassau that Vane crossed paths with other infamous names. Blackbeard himself spent time there, and so did Calico Jack Rackham and the fiery Anne Bonny. Pirates who thrived on chaos found themselves drawn to Nassau's harbour like moths to flame, and for a time the town became a gathering place for legends. Vane thrived in this atmosphere, commanding respect through fear and ensuring that his influence grew with each passing year. But Nassau was not just a pirate utopia, it was also a powder keg. By 1718, the British Crown had grown weary of pirate rule. King George I issued a proclamation offering pardons to any pirates willing to renounce their ways, and he sent Governor Woodes Rogers to Nassau to enforce royal authority. For many pirates, the pardon was tempting. After years of dangerous raids, the chance to walk away free was irresistible. Men like Benjamin Hornigold accepted, seeking to preserve their wealth and lives. Even Blackbeard briefly flirted with the idea of legitimacy, stepping into and out of pardon like a man testing the waters. But Charles Vane? He laughed at the notion. To him, taking the king's pardon was cowardice, a betrayal of everything the pirate life represented. He mocked those who bent the knee, calling them traitors and dogs. While Nassau shifted, with some pirates choosing peace, Vane doubled down. When Governor Rogers finally arrived in Nassau with a fleet, Vane staged his most infamous act of defiance. He took a captured brigantine, loaded it with gunpowder and explosives, and set it ablaze. Then, with his crew rowing safely away, he sent the burning hulk straight into the governor's fleet. The explosion ripped through the harbour, scattering Rogers's forces and shocking all who witnessed it. The message was unmistakable. Charles Vane would never bow. For a time, Nassau was his stronghold. But Rogers's arrival marked the beginning of the end. The pirate republic was dying, squeezed by the Crown's determination to crush piracy once and for all. Even in Nassau, divisions grew. Some men wanted peace, others wanted plunder, and captains began to turn on each other. Vane's unyielding defiance, once a badge of pride, now became a liability. Still, he clung to Nassau. When he returned from raids, he swaggered back into its taverns, pockets heavy with plunder, daring anyone to question his authority. But whispers followed him. His men grumbled about his reckless decisions, about his cruelty, about the way he hoarded treasure for himself. Nassau, once the place where Vane rose to power, was also the place where the cracks in his command began to widen. He was feared, yes, but increasingly he was also hated. And in the pirate world, when fear was no longer enough to hold a crew together, there was only one outcome: mutiny. For years, Charles Vane's reign as a pirate captain had been built on fear. But fear, like gunpowder, only lasts so long before it burns itself out. By 1719, the very men who once trembled at his wrath were beginning to see him for what he was, not a leader, but a liability. The seeds of mutiny were planted during one of Vane's most infamous decisions at sea. While cruising near the Bahamas, he encountered a French man-of-war, a heavily armed ship bristling with cannons. To some pirates, attacking such a vessel would have been madness. To others, it was the ultimate prize, the kind of bold strike that could make their fortunes forever. Vane, however, did not even consider it. He ordered a retreat. His crew was outraged. Pirates lived by risk, and they had joined Vane expecting bold leadership. Instead, they saw a captain too cautious to seize opportunity, yet reckless enough to endanger them when it suited his pride. The contradiction was too much to bear. In pirate society, captains were not kings. They ruled only with the consent of their crew. And Vane's men had had enough. In a dramatic vote, the crew deposed him. One by one, rough hands went up in support of removing Vane from command. His arrogance, his cruelty, and now his cowardice had sealed his fate. In his place, they elected a new captain, John Calico Jack Rackham, a man known not for savagery, but for charisma and flamboyance. For Vane, the humiliation was complete. To be stripped of command was the greatest disgrace a pirate could suffer. His men turned him out with only a small sloop and a handful of loyal followers. Once feared across the Caribbean, he was now a captain without a crew, a wolf without a pack. But Vane was not the kind of man to accept defeat quietly. In his small sloop, he prowled the seas, striking at small merchant ships, desperate to rebuild his power. Yet without the manpower or firepower of a large crew, his raids were paltry compared to the glory days. Each attack was a shadow of his former might, and each month that passed, his name carried less fear. Worse still, his enemies multiplied. The British Navy hunted him relentlessly. Former allies in Nassau turned their backs. Even among pirates, his reputation was tarnished. Men whispered that he was finished, that his arrogance had led him to ruin. The once feared Charles Vane had become a cautionary tale. The final betrayal came not from an enemy, but from fate itself. In 1719, while sailing with his small crew, Vane was caught in a storm and shipwrecked on an island. He survived, clinging to wreckage, but the disaster left him stranded and vulnerable. For weeks, he struggled to survive, his power reduced to nothing, his former glory a bitter memory. When a passing ship finally rescued him, it was not salvation, but doom. The captain of the vessel recognized Vane, and rather than offering friendship, he turned him over to the authorities. Vane's last hope, loyalty among outlaws, was gone. Even the pirate world had betrayed him. For Charles Vane, mutiny had stripped him of command. Betrayal had stripped him of freedom. And now only one fate remained, the hangman's noose. By the end of 1719, Charles Vane's world had collapsed. Once a feared name in the Caribbean, he was now reduced to commanding a small sloop, wandering the seas with only a few loyal men. The mutiny that had stripped him of power haunted him like a ghost. He had lost his ship, his crew, and the respect that once kept his enemies trembling. But Vane refused to surrender. Even in ruin, his defiance burned. He prowled the shipping lanes, striking at small merchant vessels, raiding for food and supplies. No longer the scourge of the Caribbean, he had become a scavenger, clinging to piracy with the desperation of a drowning man. Then fate dealt him another cruel blow. In the spring of 1719, his sloop was caught in a storm off the coast of an island in the Bay of Honduras. The sea raged, waves towering over the small vessel. Vane's men fought desperately at the rigging, but the ship was no match for the tempest. The mast splintered, sails tore free, and within hours, the vessel broke apart on the reefs. Vane survived, clinging to floating wreckage. With only a handful of men, he washed ashore on a deserted island. There, for weeks, he lived like a castaway, scavenging what little food and fresh water he could find. For the man who once commanded fear across the seas, it was a cruel irony, reduced to a forgotten exile, gnawed by hunger, waiting for rescue. Rescue did come, but not in the way he hoped. A passing ship spotted the survivors and brought them aboard. For a brief moment, Vane may have thought fortune had smiled on him again, but fortune had long since turned its back. The ship's captain recognized him, and instead of offering friendship, he delivered him to the authorities at Port Royal, Jamaica. It was betrayal of the highest order, but by then, Vane had few illusions left. He was marched in chains through the streets, no longer the defiant scourge of the seas, but a broken man, jeered by the very colonists who once trembled at his name. His enemies in government, eager to stamp out piracy once and for all, seized upon him as an example. Here at last was Charles Vane, the mad dog of the Caribbean, caged and beaten. Awaiting trial, he was confined to a dank cell, his once proud posture slumped. Gone were the days of swaggering through Nassau, gone were the boasts of defiance. Yet even in captivity, those who saw him reported that his eyes still burned with the same untamable fire. He had been stripped of everything, but not of his defiance. For Vane, the last voyage was not one of triumph, but of humiliation. Shipwreck, betrayal, and capture had brought him low. And yet, in the twisted logic of piracy, even this ending only added to his legend. He had refused pardon, refused to compromise, and in the end, refused to bow. His life had been chaos, and his last voyage was no different, a storm that ended in ruin. But his final chapter had yet to be written, and it would be written not on the waves, but at the gallows. When Charles Vane was dragged in chains to Port Royal, Jamaica in 1720, his fate was already sealed. Once the terror of the Caribbean, he now stood as a prisoner, broken in body, but not in spirit. His capture was a triumph for the colonial authorities, who were determined to stamp out piracy once and for all. And who better to make an example of than the man who had spat in the face of the king's pardon? The trial was swift. In Jamaica, piracy was not seen as a crime to be debated. It was treason, an offense to be stamped out with fire and rope. Witnesses were called, merchants who had lost their ships, sailors who had felt Vane's cruelty firsthand, even former pirates who testified against him in hopes of saving their own necks. Each story painted the same picture: a man who ruled by terror, who burned ships without mercy, who mocked kings and governors alike. Vane tried to defend himself. He argued that he had been loyal to his men, that he had only done what was necessary to survive. But his words fell flat. The courtroom was filled with men who had lost fortunes to piracy, governors eager to prove their loyalty to the crown, and townsfolk who had lived in fear of the black flag. None of them were interested in nuance. Charles Vane was guilty, not only of piracy but of defiance itself. The sentence was death. He was to be hanged by the neck until dead, and his body displayed as a warning to all who still dreamed of rebellion at sea. On the day of his execution, the people of Port Royal gathered in droves. Execution was spectacle, and when the condemned was a pirate of Vane's reputation, the crowd swelled with eager faces. They wanted to see the monster brought low, the man who had terrorized merchants and mocked the king, humbled by the rope. Vane was led to the gallows wearing a rough shirt and trousers, his hands bound, the noose dangling before him. Reports say he walked with a steady gait, defiant to the last. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze burning even as the hangman tightened the rope. If he was afraid, he did not show it. When the trap was sprung, Charles Vane dropped, his life ending in an instant. His body was left hanging in the Caribbean sun, a grim trophy of justice. Later, like many pirates before him, His corpse was tarred and gibbeted, displayed as a warning to any who dared take up the black flag. And yet, even in death, Vane remained larger than life. His execution was meant to erase his legend, but it only added to it. Here was the man who had never bent, never surrendered, never taken the king's pardon. He had lived as he wished, ruled by chaos, and died without compromise. For the sailors who once followed him, his death was both a warning and a memory of their own fragility. For the crown, it was a victory, proof that even the fiercest pirate could be broken. But for history, Charles Vane remains what he always was, a symbol of raw defiance, of the dangers of cruelty unchecked, of the thin line between command and mutiny. To sail with Charles Vane was to live in fear, to endure chaos, and to face ruin. His trial and execution closed his chapter, but his name endures among the pantheon of pirates, not for riches, not for cunning, but for the simple, brutal truth of who he was, a man consumed by rage, undone by his own fire. And so ended the story of Charles Vane, the pirate who ruled through fear, who spat in the face of kings, and who refused to bend until the very end. Unlike Blackbeard, who built his legend with theatrics, or Bartholomew Roberts, who commanded with discipline, Vane was pure chaos. He lived without compromise, but that very defiance doomed him. For his crew, sailing under Vane meant living on a knife's edge. One day, you might be celebrating plunder in Nassau. The next, watching your captain burn prisoners alive or throw away your lives in a reckless fight. He was unpredictable, cruel, and arrogant. And when his men could no longer stomach his leadership, they turned on him. His capture and execution were meant to erase his name. Yet even now, centuries later, we still tell his story. Because in Vane we see the raw, unfiltered truth of piracy, not the romanticized treasure hunts of storybooks, but the brutal reality of life under a captain who lived and died by defiance. But Vane's downfall also paved the way for another figure to rise. The very man his crew elected in his place, a flamboyant pirate with a taste for style and mischief, remembered not for brutality, but for the infamous flag he flew and for the company he kept, Calico Jack Rackham. Rackham's tale is one of charm and cunning, of battles fought with flair, and of his legendary partnership with two of the most notorious women in piracy, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. His story couldn't be more different from Vane's, and yet the two are forever connected, one deposed in disgrace, the other stepping into infamy. So tell me, would you have sailed under Charles Vane, knowing the fear, the chaos, and the constant danger? Or would you have turned against him like his crew? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And don't miss our next voyage, where we'll discover what it was really like to sail with Calico Jack Rackham, the pirate of style, of symbols, and of stories that still ripple through history today. Until then, may your seas be calm, your horizons wide, and your nights filled with tales of the Black Flag. Chapter 5. Calico Jack Rackham. Of all the names that echo across the Golden Age of Piracy, few have the strange charm of Calico Jack Rackham. He wasn't the fiercest pirate. He wasn't the richest. He didn't command fleets of ships like Bartholomew Roberts, nor did he spread terror like Blackbeard. And yet, his name survives, etched into history not through fear, but through style, rebellion, and the company he kept. Calico Jack's legend rests on three things: his flamboyant sense of dress, his invention of one of the most famous pirate flags in history, and his partnership with two of the most notorious women ever to sail under the Black Flag, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. But to sail with Calico Jack wasn't to serve under a ruthless tyrant like Charles Vane, nor to follow a calculating commander like Roberts. Life under Rackham was something else entirely. His leadership was charismatic but flawed, his ambition grand but rarely matched by success. His men followed him not because they feared him, but because they liked him. or at least they liked his style. Imagine Nassau in the 1710s. The taverns are alive with music, dice clattering on tables, rum spilling across the floor. And there in the centre, dressed not in drab rags but in bright calico cloth, is Jack Rackham, laughing, charming, boasting of his next adventure. Where Charles Vane ruled with cruelty, Rackham won men over with wit. Where other captains kept discipline, Rackham let chaos swirl. To sail with Calico was to join a crew where freedom was valued more than order, and where every raid was an excuse to celebrate. But charm alone doesn't win battles. Rackham's career was filled with daring raids, yes, but also with failure, capture, and a spectacular fall. His story is not one of vast treasure or naval victories, but of defiance, flamboyance, and doomed romance. He was, in many ways, a pirate who embodied the spirit of rebellion more than the reality of success. And yet, perhaps that's why his name endures. The skull and crossed swords flag he designed has become one of the most iconic symbols of piracy. His partnership with Anne Bonny and Mary Read remains one of the most remarkable tales in maritime history. And his life, short though it was, has inspired centuries of stories. Tonight, we'll step aboard the ship of Calico Jack Rackham. We'll see what it was like to follow him, to live under his carefree but reckless command, to sail with Anne and Mary at your side, and to witness the final downfall of a pirate whose style outshone his substance. This isn't the story of the most successful pirate. It's the story of the most stylish, the most flamboyant, the man who dressed like a peacock and died like a rebel. This is the tale of Calico Jack Rackham. John Rackham, the man who would one day be remembered as Calico Jack, was born around 1682. Little is known of his early life, but by the time his name began appearing in the records of the Caribbean, he was already a pirate, or at least a pirate in the making. Unlike Blackbeard or Roberts, who carefully honed reputations as formidable leaders, Rackham built his identity around personality, charm, and style. And style, for Rackham, meant calico. In an age when most sailors wore whatever rags they could patch together, Rackham stood out for his brightly patterned shirts made from calico cloth. Bold colors, exotic prints. These garments were imported from India and expensive by pirate standards. They announced him before he ever spoke. Where Charles Vane was terrifying and Blackbeard was theatrical, Rackham was flamboyant, the kind of man who wanted to be noticed, even in the crowded taverns of Nassau. Rackham first appears in pirate history as the quartermaster under Charles Vane. The quartermaster was second only to the captain, tasked with keeping discipline, dividing plunder, and serving as the voice of the crew. It was a powerful role, and it gave Rackham the chance to prove his leadership. But Vane and Rackham were very different men. Where Vane ruled with cruelty and fear, Rackham was more relaxed, easygoing, and charismatic. While Vane's temper kept his men in line, Rackham's humour and wit earned him their loyalty. The breaking point came in 1719, when Vane refused to fight a French warship, choosing instead to retreat. His crew, furious at what they saw as cowardice, voted to depose him. In his place, they chose Rackham. The flamboyant quartermaster became captain overnight, rising not through terror, but through popularity. He was now the master of his own ship, with the loyalty of his men and the opportunity to carve his name into history. Rackham's early command reflected his personality. He wasn't reckless like Vane, nor calculating like Roberts. Instead, he was opportunistic. He led raids on small merchant vessels, striking quickly and vanishing before larger ships could catch him. His style of piracy was less about amassing great fortunes and more about keeping his crew fed, supplied, and entertained. The plunder was modest, but the rum flowed freely, and the celebrations were legendary. But what truly set Rackham apart was his symbolism. He designed one of the most recognizable pirate flags in history, a skull with two crossed swords. Unlike the traditional Jolly Roger with its crossed bones, Rackham's flag was more aggressive, more stylish, more him. It announced to the world not just that pirates were coming, but that Calico Jack was coming. To sail under that flag was to belong to something memorable, something iconic. Rackham's charm also extended beyond his crew. In Nassau, he was a fixture in taverns and brothels, laughing, drinking, and spinning tales. He was no tyrant captain, but rather a companion, someone who blurred the line between leader and comrade. His men respected him not because they feared him, but because they liked him. That bond made life under Rackham more appealing than under harsher captains, even if it also meant a lack of discipline that sometimes cost them dearly. Of course, popularity and flamboyance only went so far in the brutal world of piracy. Rackham's raids were small, his prizes modest, and his reputation less feared than others. But he had one advantage few pirates could claim: Anne Bonny. Their meeting in Nassau would change both their lives. Anne, the fiery Irishwoman who had defied her husband and lived openly among pirates, was drawn to Rackham's charm and colour. He, in turn, was captivated by her spirit. Their affair scandalized the pirate haven, and when Anne's husband sought to expose her, Rackham offered her a place at his side, on land and at sea. Together, they would become one of piracy's most famous couples, a partnership as notorious as it was doomed. But that chapter lay just ahead. For now, Calico Jack was rising, carving out his identity not through fear or fortune, but through style, wit, and companionship. He had won command from Charles Vane, flown his own flag, and built a crew that followed him by choice rather than coercion. It was a shaky foundation for a pirate's career, but it was unmistakably his own. And as the seas of the Caribbean grew darker, Rackham's flamboyance would only shine brighter, until, inevitably, it brought him to ruin. To sail with Jack Rackham was unlike serving under most other pirate captains. If Blackbeard's ship was a floating theatre of terror, and Charles Vane's deck was a place of fear and punishment, then Rackham's vessel was something else entirely, part pirate ship, part carnival, and part tavern on the waves. Life under Rackham reflected the man himself, colourful, loose, and sometimes reckless. His ship was no grand galleon or heavily armed warship, but a nimble sloop, ideal for quick raids on small merchant vessels. It wasn't built for large-scale battles, but it was perfect for hit-and-run piracy, slipping in and out of shipping lanes before the authorities could respond. For his crew, this meant fewer massive hauls, but also fewer crushing defeats. Rackham avoided picking fights with ships that could overpower him. Instead, he targeted smaller, softer prizes, merchant sloops laden with rum, sugar, or supplies. The work was dangerous, yes, but compared to the reckless charges of Vane or the endless grind under Roberts, life with Rackham felt almost casual. But it was in the atmosphere aboard his ship that Rackham stood out. His men described him as easygoing and charismatic, more inclined to laugh with his crew than berate them. Discipline was loose. Rum was plentiful. Dice and cards made their rounds on deck. The boundaries between captain and crew blurred, with Rackham often drinking and joking among his men. It gave the impression of equality, a shared brotherhood. That looseness had its benefits. Sailors who grew weary of harsh captains sometimes gravitated to Rackham's banner. He offered a life with less brutality, more freedom, and a sense of belonging. His calico shirts and flamboyant style weren't just personal quirks. They symbolized a rejection of the drab, rigid hierarchies that most sailors despised. Rackham embodied a kind of freedom that drew men to him, even if it made his command less efficient. But the looseness had its dangers too. Without strict order, discipline often frayed. Some raids were poorly planned, others botched entirely. Victories were celebrated with days of drunkenness, leaving the crew vulnerable. And while Rackham could inspire loyalty with charm, He lacked the ruthless decisiveness of more feared captains. Still, there was something magnetic about him. He wasn't a towering figure like Blackbeard, nor a calculating tactician like Roberts. Instead, he made his crew feel like they were part of something fun, something different. To sail under Rackham was to live with constant excitement, one day drinking in Nassau, the next chasing down a fat merchant ship, the next hiding from the navy in a deserted cove. And then, of course, there was Anne Bonny. Life under Rackham's command changed dramatically once she joined the crew. Anne wasn't a woman content to stay ashore while the men played pirate. She fought, drank, and cursed as fiercely as any man, earning the respect of Rackham's sailors. To have her aboard gave the ship a sense of uniqueness, a wild energy unlike any other crew. And when Mary Read later disguised herself as a man and joined them, Rackham's ship became infamous, not just for its flamboyant captain, but for the two deadly women who fought at his side. On deck, daily life was a blend of hardship and revelry. Sailors mended sails and scrubbed decks, loaded cannons and stood watch. But when the work was done, the ship often transformed into a floating tavern. Fiddles played, dice clattered, mugs clinked. Rackham was always at the center of it, smiling in his bright calico shirt, a cup of rum in hand, cracking jokes with the men who adored him. But beneath the laughter, danger always lurked. Rackham's easygoing nature sometimes made him underestimate the risks. His small prizes rarely built lasting wealth. His crew, though loyal, lacked the discipline of hardened fleets. And though his ship was nimble, it could never stand toe-to-toe with the larger warships patrolling the Caribbean. Yet for the men who served with him, none of that mattered. They weren't chasing vast fortunes or empire-shaking victories. They were chasing freedom, rum, and the thrill of living outside the law. Under Rackham, they found it. To sail with Calico Jack was to live like a spark in the dark, brief, bright, and unforgettable. If Jack Rackham had sailed alone, history might have remembered him as a colorful but minor pirate. His raids were modest, his victories limited, and his flamboyant style more memorable than his plunder. But fate placed two extraordinary women on his deck, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and with them, Rackham's story became legend. Anne Bonny was already infamous in Nassau before she ever joined Rackham. Born in Ireland around 1697, she was the daughter of a lawyer and his servant. She grew up strong-willed and fiery, defying every expectation placed on her. By the time she reached the Caribbean, she had married a small-time sailor, James Bonny, but she found no satisfaction in the life of a respectable wife. Instead, Anne was drawn to the pirates of Nassau, their lawlessness, their freedom, their refusal to bow to kings or husbands. It was there, in the raucous taverns of Nassau, that she met John Calico Jack Rackham. He was charming, flamboyant, and full of life. Everything her husband was not. Their affair scandalized the settlement, and when James Bonny tried to expose her, she chose Rackham without hesitation. When Rackham offered her a place aboard his ship, she didn't shy away. She disguised herself as a man, joined the crew, and quickly proved she was every bit as fierce as her shipmates. Life with Anne aboard was electric. She wasn't a mascot or a token, she was a fighter. Armed with pistols and cutlasses, she stood shoulder to shoulder with the men during raids. Sailors who mocked her quickly learned the cost of underestimating her temper. For Rackham's crew, Anne's presence added a fiery spark, and for Rackham himself, it made his ship feel alive with rebellion and romance. But Anne was not the only woman to join Rackham's crew. Around 1720, another figure emerged, Mary Read. Mary had lived a life of disguise from the start, dressing as a boy in her youth to gain opportunities denied to women. She had served in the British Army, married, and then, after her husband's death, returned to sea disguised once more as a man. By the time she crossed paths with Rackham, she was already seasoned in combat, fearless and hardened by hardship. Mary joined the crew under the guise of a young sailor, but Anne soon discovered her secret. The two became close friends, perhaps even more. And when Mary's identity was revealed, the crew accepted her without hesitation. After all, she fought with more ferocity than most men. Together, Anne and Mary gave Rackham's crew an energy unlike any other. In battle, they fought on the front lines, pistols blazing, blades flashing. They cursed, drank, and brawled with the men, earning respect through sheer grit. For the sailors of the Caribbean, the sight of two women fighting as pirates was shocking, unforgettable, and terrifying. Stories spread quickly, adding to Rackham's reputation, not for his victories, but for his crew's audacity. Life aboard with Anne and Mary was rowdy, dangerous, and intoxicating. Their presence emboldened the crew, turning every raid into something larger than life. For Rackham, their loyalty was priceless. Anne was his lover and partner, Mary his comrade and ally. Together, the three formed the heart of a pirate crew that cared less about wealth than about freedom, thrill, and defiance. And yet, for all their fire, the same weaknesses remained. Rackham's raids were small, his targets modest, and his caution often outweighed by his crew's reckless energy. Anne and Mary gave him fame, but they couldn't give him fortune. Still, when history remembers Calico Jack Rackham, it is not his victories or his treasure that stand out. It is this: the flamboyant captain who sailed with two women as fierce as any pirate who ever lived. In a world that expected women to stay ashore, Anne Bonny and Mary Read carved their names into the sea, and Calico Jack rode the wave of their legend. By 1719 and 1720, the seas of the Caribbean were alive with whispers of a strange pirate crew. It wasn't their wealth that made them famous, nor the scale of their victories. It was their audacity, the flamboyant captain in bright calico, and the two women who fought alongside his men. Wherever Calico Jack Rackham sailed, stories followed, and in the world of piracy, stories were often as valuable as gold. Rackham's ship, usually a small, fast sloop, prowled the shipping lanes between Jamaica and the Bahamas. He avoided heavily armed vessels, preferring to strike quick and vanish into the blue horizon. His targets were modest: small merchant sloops, fishing boats, or lightly guarded traders. The plunder was rarely spectacular: barrels of rum, sacks of sugar, bolts of cloth, and the occasional chest of coin. But it kept his crew supplied and his legend alive. For the merchants and colonists of the Caribbean, however, these raids were infuriating. A single lost cargo could cripple a small trader, and Rackham's unpredictability made him a constant nuisance. Colonists reported his attacks with growing alarm, describing not only his daring, but the presence of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who fought fiercely in men's clothing, cursing and firing pistols with shocking ferocity. For the colonial authorities, this was more than piracy. It was scandal. Women at sea, dressed as men, defying every expectation of gender and propriety, were as shocking as the raids themselves. Rackham's reputation grew not because he commanded great fleets or won epic battles, but because he represented rebellion in its purest form. His flag, the skull with crossed swords, became a symbol of his defiance. It was different from the bones and hourglasses of other pirates. Sleeker, sharper, more stylish, it was a statement as much as a warning. When it rose against the horizon, sailors knew they faced not just pirates but Calico Jack. Life aboard remained lively, if precarious. Rackham's leadership style meant that discipline was loose, celebrations frequent, and risks often underestimated. Victories were followed by wild nights of drinking, music, and dancing on deck. The ship was as much a floating party as it was a vessel of war. To his men, this was part of the appeal. To outsiders, it looked like recklessness. Still, there were moments of genuine danger. Colonial patrol ships hunted Rackham's crew relentlessly. More than once, they were forced to abandon prizes and flee into hidden coves or shallow waters where larger ships could not follow. Anne and Mary's presence gave the crew courage in these moments, their ferocity in battle rallying the men when hope seemed dim. Eyewitnesses later recalled that when most of Rackham's crew wavered, it was the women who fought hardest, pistols blazing, voices carrying across the deck with curses that would make hardened sailors blush. And yet, for all their boldness, Rackham's raids never elevated him to the heights of piracy's great captains. He lacked the cunning of Roberts, the intimidation of Blackbeard, or even the ruthless drive of Vane. His reputation was built not on fortune, but on spectacle. For some, that was enough. For others, it marked him as a pirate who burned brightly but shallowly, a man destined for legend, but not for lasting power. Still, the colonies seethed under his nuisance raids, and the governors were determined to end his career. Warrants were issued, patrols doubled, and rewards offered for his capture. Rackham's flamboyant reign had drawn too much attention, and the jaws of the empire were closing around him. But for the moment, he sailed on, his sloop darting through the Caribbean, his crew laughing, drinking, and fighting under a flag that promised defiance above all. By late 1720, the flamboyant days of Calico Jack Rackham's piratical revelry were drawing to a close. His raids, modest though they were, had stirred up too much anger among the Jamaican authorities. Colonial governors had tolerated pirates in earlier years when they could be useful against rival empires, but those days were over. Now, piracy was a stain to be scrubbed clean. Rackham, with his small sloop and scandalous crew, became a target too enticing to ignore. The man chosen to hunt him down was Captain Jonathan Barnett, a former privateer who knew the waters of the Caribbean well. Barnett was tasked with tracking Rackham's ship, the Revenge, and putting an end to its nuisance once and for all. With orders in hand and the backing of Jamaican authorities, Barnett set out into the waters around Negril, where Rackham was last reported prowling. Rackham, meanwhile, was anchored off the coast, his crew enjoying one of their all-too-frequent celebrations. They had captured a small fishing boat earlier that week, little more than a few barrels of supplies, but for Rackham's men, any excuse was enough to drink and carouse. The night was thick with rum, laughter, and music, the ship swaying gently under the stars. On deck, some crewmen slumped in drunken stupors, while others sang bawdy songs. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, as always, kept pace with the men, drinking and laughing, though both remained sharper than most of their companions. It was in this state of revelry that Barnett's ship found them. Under cover of night, Barnett approached, his sails trimmed, his cannons ready. By the time Rackham's crew spotted the looming silhouette, it was too late. Barnett hailed them, demanding their surrender in the king's name. Panic erupted on the Revenge. Most of Rackham's crew were too drunk to fight. They stumbled, fell, or hid below decks. A few managed to fumble for pistols and cutlasses, but their resistance was pitiful compared to the disciplined volleys from Barnett's men. In the chaos, only two figures stood firm, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Eyewitnesses would later swear that the two women fought like demons. Pistols in both hands, cutlasses flashing, they cursed and roared at the enemy. Mary Read, furious at the cowardice of her shipmates, reportedly fired her pistol into the hold, shouting that if the men would not fight, they deserved to die like dogs. Anne, equally fierce, slashed at boarders, spitting insults with every blow. Rackham himself, his reputation did not shine that night. Accounts suggest that he surrendered quickly once it was clear the fight was hopeless. While Anne and Mary fought to the last, Rackham was taken without glory, bound and hauled aboard Barnett's vessel. His flamboyant calico shirt, once a mark of defiance, now made him an easy figure to mock as he sat in chains. By dawn, it was over. Barnett had his prize. The notorious Calico Jack Rackham, along with Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the remnants of his crew, were prisoners. The sea that had once been their playground had betrayed them at last. The capture marked the end of Rackham's career and the final act of his legend. His flamboyance had carried him far, but in the end, it could not save him from discipline, order, and the steady hand of a determined hunter. But his story was not yet finished. The real drama was still to come, in the courtrooms of Jamaica, where Rackham, Anne, and Mary would face judgment, and where their names would be etched forever into pirate lore. When the captured crew of the Revenge arrived in Spanish Town, Jamaica, in November 1720, the spectacle was irresistible. A flamboyant pirate captain in Calico, 2 women disguised as men who had fought like demons, and a band of drunken sailors. This was not just another pirate trial. It was theatre. Rackham, Anne Bonny Mary Read, and the others were locked in the dank cells of the Jamaican prison while colonial officials prepared the proceedings. For years, governors had sought to stamp out piracy, and now they had the perfect chance to make an example. The trial was swift. Witnesses testified to Rackham's raids on fishing boats and small traders. The evidence was clear. He had plundered under the black flag. Rackham offered little defense. He sat sullen, his charm dulled, the bright calico shirt that had once made him stand out now a pathetic reminder of past swagger. His crew, many of them ashamed or broken, followed him into condemnation. The sentence was death. Rackham and his men were to be hanged by the neck until dead, their bodies displayed as a warning to others who dared to defy the crown. But it was Anne Bonny and Mary Read who stole the spotlight. When they were called to trial, their true identities as women were revealed, shocking the courtroom. The colony gossiped furiously. 2 women, dressed as men, had fought alongside pirates with unmatched ferocity. Their names were whispered with equal measures of scandal and awe. Both women claimed they were pregnant, a defense that spared them from immediate execution. The court, bound by law, granted them temporary reprieve. Mary Read would later die in prison of fever, but Anne Bonny's fate is more mysterious. Some say she was quietly released thanks to her influential father. Others insist she lived a long life in obscurity, her days as a pirate fading into rumor. Calico Jack, however, had no such escape. On November 18, 1720, he was led to the gallows. The people of Spanish Town gathered eagerly, hungry to see the man whose antics had scandalized the Caribbean. Rackham walked to the scaffold in silence, the noose swaying in the humid breeze. Before his death, Anne Bonny was allowed to see him one last time. According to legend, her words cut sharper than any blade. "If you had fought like a man, you would not now be hanged like a dog." It was a brutal epitaph for a man who had built his legend on style rather than strength. Moments later, the trap was sprung, and John Calico Jack Rackham's body dangled lifeless. His flamboyant life ended not in glory, but in disgrace. His corpse was taken to a small quay off the coast of Jamaica, where it was displayed in an iron cage, gibbeted, as a warning to all sailors. There, exposed to sun, wind, and sea, the man who once pranced in calico became a grim skeleton of piracy's downfall. And yet, Rackham's legacy endured. His raids may have been modest, his victories few, but his flag, the skull with crossed swords, became one of the most iconic symbols of piracy. His partnership with Anne Bonny and Mary Read turned him into a legend larger than life. In the end, Rackham's story was not one of wealth or power. It was the story of defiance, of style, of a man who made himself unforgettable, not through fear, but through audacity. To sail with Calico Jack was to sail with laughter, with colour, with danger, and inevitably with doom. And so ended the life of Calico Jack Rackham, a pirate remembered not for great victories or vast treasure, but for the colour and style with which he lived. His calico shirts, his iconic flag, his charm and flamboyance, all of it carved him a place in history. Yet when his moment of truth arrived, it wasn't Jack who left the deepest mark. It was the 2 women who stood at his side. Rackham's legacy is tied inseparably to Anne Bonny and Mary Read. In the heat of battle, when his drunken crew faltered, it was Anne and Mary who fought like lions. While Rackham surrendered, they stood defiant. And though he met his end at the gallows, their stories carried on, fiery, scandalous, unforgettable. What does Calico Jack's tale teach us? That style can win loyalty, but it cannot win battles. That charm can light a fire, but it cannot shield you from the hangman's rope. And yet, his name still survives, not as a conqueror, but as the pirate who sailed with two of the fiercest women the seas had ever seen. Now I want to hear from you. Would you have joined Calico Jack's crew for the freedom and laughter, or would you have preferred the stricter, more disciplined command of someone like Bartholomew Roberts? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'll be reading them all. But don't set sail just yet, because if you thought Calico Jack's story was wild, wait until you hear what came next. Our next voyage will follow the lives of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who defied society, dressed as men, fought as pirates, and became legends in their own right. Their tale is one of rebellion, fury, and survival, and it may just be the most unforgettable chapter in the Golden Age of Piracy. So join me next time as we uncover what it was really like to sail with Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Until then, may your seas be calm, your horizons wide, and your nights filled with tales of the Black Flag.
Chapter 6. Anne Bonny and Mary Read.
In the taverns of Nassau, amid the smoke of lanterns and the clatter of dice, the name of Anne Bonny was whispered with equal parts fear and fascination. A woman who defied her husband, her family, and the expectations of society itself, she threw herself headlong into the life of a pirate. Dressed in men's clothes, pistol at her belt, hair wild in the sea wind, she was said to curse like the saltiest of sailors and fight harder than half the men aboard. But Anne was not alone. Sailing at her side was another woman, just as fierce, just as bold. Mary Read. Mary had lived her whole life in disguise, first as a boy to inherit her brother's birthright, then as a soldier in European wars, and later as a sailor. Hardened by survival, Mary carried herself with a grim determination. On Rackham's deck, she revealed herself not as a man, but as a woman who could outfight most of the crew. Together, Anne Bonny and Mary Read shattered every convention of their age. In a world where women were expected to stay ashore, they strode the decks with pistols drawn and cutlasses flashing. They weren't passengers. They weren't mascots. They were pirates, real, ferocious, and unforgettable. Their story has often been overshadowed by the men they sailed with, Calico Jack Rackham chief among them. But the truth is that Anne and Mary were the beating heart of that crew. When Rackham faltered, they stood firm. When others cowered, they fought. In the final desperate battle that ended Rackham's career, eyewitnesses swore it was the two women who fought like lions while the men hid below decks. To sail with Anne Bonny and Mary Read was to step into a world of fire and defiance. Nights spent drinking in Nassau's taverns, days spent raiding small vessels, moments of laughter, love, and violence woven together into a life that could never last, but would never be forgotten. Tonight, we'll walk their path. We'll see Anne's fiery rebellion and Mary's long disguise. We'll stand beside them on Rackham's deck, pistols drawn, as the sea roars around them. And we'll follow them to the courtroom in Jamaica, where their fates took two very different turns. This isn't just a story of women at sea. It's the story of two rebels who refused to be confined, who claimed freedom in the most dangerous way possible, and who carved their names into the Golden Age of Piracy. This is the tale of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Anne Bonny's story began not in the Caribbean, but in Ireland, around 1697. She was the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer, William Cormac, and his servant woman. In a society that valued reputation above all else, this scandal could have ruined him. Instead, Cormac disguised Anne as a boy and moved with her mother to the New World, settling in the colony of South Carolina. From the start, Anne was marked by defiance. She grew up strong-willed, fiery, and unwilling to bow to anyone's authority. Tales later claimed that as a young girl she stabbed a servant who insulted her, and that she beat another man so badly he nearly died. Whether those stories are true or exaggerated, they reflect the image Anne carved for herself, a woman who would not be controlled. As she grew older, Anne's temper and independence clashed with the expectations placed upon her. Her father hoped she would marry respectably and help secure his standing in the colony. Instead, Anne fell for a small-time sailor named James Bonny. Her father despised him, and when Anne chose to marry him anyway, Cormac disowned her. Stripped of her inheritance, Anne left with her new husband for the Bahamas. It was in Nassau that Anne Bonny truly found her world. Nassau was the pirate republic, a place where men who had once been sailors, privateers, and criminals now lived under their own rules. Taverns rang with music, rum flowed like water, and the black flag flew proudly above the harbour. Here, Anne shed the restrictions of polite society and embraced the life she craved, free, lawless, and dangerous. But her marriage quickly soured. James Bonny had no pirate's soul. He became an informant for the governor, turning in outlaws for reward money. To Anne, it was betrayal. She despised cowardice and hypocrisy, and she had no interest in living as the obedient wife of a snitch. Instead, she turned her gaze to the pirates who swaggered through Nassau's streets, men who lived boldly and answered to no one. Among them was John Calico Jack Rackham. Unlike her husband, Rackham was charismatic, stylish, and daring. His calico shirts and easy grin marked him as a man who cared more for freedom than respectability. Anne was drawn to him immediately. The two began an affair, scandalizing Nassau. James Bonny sought to punish her, dragging her before the governor, but Anne would not be humiliated. She left James and chose Rackham, openly defying both her husband and the colonial authorities. When Rackham offered her a place aboard his ship, Anne accepted without hesitation. She disguised herself as a man, tying her hair back, donning trousers and a loose shirt, and carrying pistols at her belt. She didn't just come along for the ride, she fought. On raids, she boarded ships with cutlass in hand, as fierce as any of the crew. Sailors who mocked her quickly learned that Anne Bonny's fury was not to be trifled with. Life at sea suited her. She drank, swore, and fought alongside the men, earning their respect not as a woman, but as a pirate. Rackham adored her spirit, and together they became one of the most infamous couples of the age. But Anne's presence aboard was more than romance. It was rebellion in its purest form. Every day she spent on that deck was a defiance of the world that sought to confine her. By the time 1720 arrived, Anne Bonny was no longer just a scandalous woman. She was a pirate, a warrior, and a legend in the making. Her story was only beginning, and fate was about to introduce her to someone who would become her equal, her ally, and perhaps her mirror, Mary Read. If Anne Bonny's life was marked by rebellion, Mary Read's was shaped by disguise. Born in England around 1685, Mary was the daughter of a widow who faced poverty after her husband's death. Mary had an older brother who stood to inherit family support, but when he died young, her mother devised a desperate plan. She dressed Mary as a boy and passed her off as her late son in order to keep the financial aid from his grandmother. Thus, from childhood, Mary learned to live as someone she was not. She grew into her disguise, playing the role of a boy so convincingly that few ever suspected the truth. When she was old enough, she continued in that role, not just out of necessity, but because it opened doors barred to women. As a teenager, Mary found work as a footboy, and later enlisted in the military, still dressed as a man. She served as a soldier in the Low Countries during the War of the Spanish Succession. Accounts say she fought bravely, holding her own in the rough, brutal world of war. At one point, she revealed her secret to a fellow soldier, fell in love, and married him. Together, they opened an inn, but when her husband died young, Mary returned to her disguise and the only life she knew, life as a man. She signed onto ships as a sailor, hiding her identity beneath loose shirts and broad gestures. For years, she lived this way, moving from ship to ship, blending into the background. Eventually, she found herself aboard a vessel bound for the West Indies. Fate intervened when that ship was captured by pirates. Mary, still dressed as a man, joined the raiders rather than face death. She proved herself quickly in battle, fighting fiercely and earning their trust. When those pirates later accepted a royal pardon, Mary joined a merchant vessel, but her life of piracy wasn't finished. In 1720, she crossed paths with Calico Jack Rackham and his crew. Whether she joined voluntarily or as part of a captured ship is unclear, but what's certain is that she quickly made her mark. Anne Bonny, ever sharp-eyed, saw through Mary's disguise. Some say Anne was initially drawn to her, thinking she was a young, handsome man. Others claim she recognized her true identity almost at once. However it happened, the two women formed a bond that would change both their lives. When Mary's secret was revealed to the crew, there was shock, but not rejection. By then, she had already proven herself as a fighter. She swore, drank, and fought alongside them, her ferocity undeniable. To the men, she was no longer simply a woman pretending to be one of them. She was a pirate in her own right. Mary's years in disguise had hardened her. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had survived against the odds, who had built a life on deception and courage. On Rackham's ship, she no longer had to hide. She could fight openly, side by side with Anne Bonny, and together they became a pair that struck fear and fascination across the Caribbean. In a world that dismissed women as weak, Mary Read had lived as a man, fought as a soldier, and now carved her name into history as a pirate. With Anne, she had found not just an ally, but a mirror, another woman who defied every expectation. And with both of them aboard, Rackham's ship became unlike any other on the seas. With Anne Bonny and Mary Read aboard, Rackham's ship became something the Caribbean had never seen before. Two women, dressed as men, armed and unflinching, fighting shoulder to shoulder with hardened sailors. It was a sight that defied every convention of the age. Most women at sea were passengers, captives, or camp followers. Anne and Mary were none of these. They were pirates, and they intended to prove it. Anne and Mary quickly became inseparable. Their bond was forged in fire, the fire of battle, of rebellion, and of shared defiance. Anne, with her fiery temper and reckless courage, was bold and brash, ready to leap into the thick of a fight with a pistol in each hand. Mary, hardened by years of disguise and soldiering, was more disciplined, more deliberate, but no less fierce. Together, they balanced one another, Anne's wildness and Mary's grit, forming a partnership that their shipmates came to respect and sometimes fear. When Rackham's sloop chased down small merchant ships, it was often Anne and Mary who led the charge. Witnesses later swore that in boarding actions, the women fought with unmatched ferocity. While drunken or hesitant men hung back, Anne and Mary surged forward, pistols blazing, cutlasses flashing. Their shouts carried over the chaos, curses sharp and cutting, their presence igniting the crew into action. It wasn't just bravado. They earned their place. Anne was said to have killed more than one man who mocked her or underestimated her. Mary, quick with her blade, reportedly struck down enemies before they could even grasp that they were facing a woman. For the captured merchants, the shock was unforgettable. To be boarded by pirates was terrifying enough, but to face women among them, fighting with the strength and fury of devils, was something that left them speechless in courtrooms years later. Off the battlefield, Anne and Mary lived much like their crewmates. They drank rum, told stories, and played at dice on deck. They swore as hard as the men, and in arguments, Neither hesitated to draw steel. To some of the crew, they were comrades. To others, they were unsettling reminders that this ship was unlike any other. But none could deny their courage. For Rackham, their presence was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they gave his crew an energy and reputation that made them famous. On the other, they made him appear less the central figure. In battle, when Rackham was cautious, it was Anne and Mary who stood tallest. It was their names that spread in whispers through the taverns and courts. Still, the trio became inseparable in reputation. Rackham, Anne, and Mary were the heart of that flamboyant ship. They weren't chasing great fortunes or empire-shattering prizes. They chased freedom, thrill, and the sheer joy of living outside the law. In their world, where life was short and the noose always waiting, they chose to live fiercely, without compromise. And yet, for all their bravado, danger was always close. Colonial authorities grew increasingly furious at Rackham's raids, and Anne and Mary's fame only heightened their outrage. 2 women at sea, defying gender, law, and king. It was more than scandalous. It was intolerable. The hunt was closing in. But before the end came, Anne and Mary had carved a legend unlike any other. They weren't just passengers in Rackham's story. They were its fiercest flames. By the autumn of 1720, the end was closing in on Rackham's crew. Colonial authorities had grown tired of his nuisance raids, and the scandal of Anne Bonny and Mary Read only sharpened their resolve. The presence of 2 women fighting like devils on deck was more than piracy. It was an affront to every order of society. And so the hunt intensified. On a humid October night, Rackham's sloop, the Revenge, lay anchored off the coast of Jamaica. The mood aboard was festive, as it often was after a successful prize. A captured fishing boat had yielded little more than supplies, but for Rackham's men, any excuse was enough to drink. Lanterns swung in the sea breeze, mugs of rum clattered, and the crew sang bawdy songs into the night. Anne and Mary, though not immune to revelry, remained sharper than most, keeping their pistols close at hand. It was in this state of drunken celebration that Captain Jonathan Barnett, a former privateer commissioned by the governor of Jamaica, found them. His ship crept through the night, sails trimmed, the sea quiet under the stars. By the time Rackham's crew noticed the shadow looming toward them, it was far too late. Barnett hailed them, demanding their surrender in the name of the king. Chaos erupted on the Revenge. Most of the crew, sodden with rum, stumbled in panic. Some tried to flee below deck. A few fumbled for weapons but were too slow, too clumsy. Rackham, caught off guard, faltered, but not Anne Bonny and Mary Read. As Barnett's men opened fire and began boarding, the 2 women surged forward, pistols blazing. They cursed, shouted, and cut down enemies with a ferocity that shocked even the seasoned privateers. Eyewitnesses later swore that it was Anne and Mary alone who fought like lions while the men cowered. Mary, furious at the cowardice of her shipmates, reportedly stormed to the hatch leading below deck, fired her pistol into the hold and shouted, "If there's a man among ye, you'll come up and fight like the rest of us. If not, stay down there and rot." Her fury echoed through the ship, but few dared rise. Anne fought with equal passion, her cutlass flashing under the lantern light. She spat curses at the boarders, her voice carrying across the deck, daring them to come closer. For every man who faltered, she seemed to grow bolder, embodying the very spirit of defiance. But courage alone could not turn the tide. Barnett's crew was sober, disciplined, and armed with superior numbers. Slowly, inevitably, Anne and Mary were overwhelmed. Rackham himself, far from the image of a daring captain, surrendered quickly once resistance became hopeless. Bound in chains, he was dragged aboard Barnett's vessel, his bright calico shirt now a mockery of his fallen pride. By dawn, the battle was over. The Revenge was in ruins, her crew shackled, her captain disgraced. But the legend of that night would not belong to Calico Jack. It belonged to Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who fought to the bitter end while their shipmates hid. It was their last stand at sea, but their story was not finished. Ahead lay the prison cells of Jamaica, the courtroom in Spanish Town, and the judgment of the hangman's noose. The capture of Calico Jack Rackham and his crew caused a sensation in Jamaica. Word spread quickly through Spanish Town and beyond. The flamboyant pirate was in chains, and with him 2 women who had fought more fiercely than all the men combined. For the colonial authorities, it was a triumph, a chance to make an example of piracy and the scandal of women at sea. The prisoners were dragged to the dank cells of Spanish Town's jail, where the stench of rot and the sound of clanging chains filled the air. For Rackham, the days passed in gloom. His once proud calico shirt was reduced to rags, his charm silenced by despair. His crew fared no better. Many sunk into silence, knowing what awaited them. But Anne Bonny and Mary Read were different. Witnesses claimed they carried themselves with defiance even in captivity, their eyes sharp, their words unbroken. While their shipmates slumped in shame, Anne and Mary whispered to each other through the bars, plotting, laughing, refusing to yield. The trial opened in late November 1720. The courthouse was packed with spectators, eager to glimpse the notorious pirates. Judges in powdered wigs presided, while merchants and naval officers testified to Rackham's raids. One by one, the charges were read: piracy upon the high seas, theft, and defiance of the crown. Rackham offered little in his defense. He sat in silence, head bowed, while witnesses condemned him. His crew fared no better, each condemned to death. The sentence was swift. They were to be hanged, their bodies displayed as a warning to others. But when it came time for Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the court gasped. Their true identities as women were revealed publicly for the first time. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. 2 women, disguised as men, who had fought like warriors. It was scandalous, unthinkable, and yet undeniable. The judges demanded their plea. Anne and Mary responded with calm but defiant words. They both claimed to be pregnant. Under English law, the execution of a pregnant woman was forbidden until after the child was born. Their sentencing was postponed, buying them time while their shipmates marched toward the gallows. It was during this time that Anne was allowed a final meeting with Rackham. The 2 stood face to face, chains rattling between them. According to legend, her words were sharper than any blade. Had you fought like a man, you would not now be hanged like a dog. With that, she turned away, leaving Rackham to his fate. On November 18th, Rackham and the rest of the male crew were executed. Their bodies were displayed in gibbets along the coast, grim skeletons swaying in the tropical breeze. Rackham's corpse was placed on a small quay that still bears his name, Rackham's Quay. Anne and Mary, however, remained in prison, spared for the time being by their claim of pregnancy. Their fates, though, would diverge. Mary, already weakened by illness, fell ill with fever in 1721 and died behind bars. Her child, if she carried one, did not survive. Anne Bonny's fate remains a mystery. Some say her influential father secured her release, allowing her to vanish into obscurity. Others believe she lived out her days quietly in Jamaica, or even returned to the American colonies. The records end in silence, leaving historians to wonder if the fiery pirate queen truly escaped the hangman's noose. What is certain is that in that Jamaican courtroom, Anne Bonny and Mary Read became legends. They had stood before judges, exposed as women in a man's world, and refused to yield. Their names would be whispered for centuries, not as victims, but as defiant rebels who lived and died on their own terms. When the gallows claimed Calico Jack and his crew, most assumed their stories would fade into the endless tide of piracy. Dozens of pirates had swung before, their names remembered only briefly before sinking into obscurity. But Anne Bonny and Mary Read were different. Their lives, their defiance, and their refusal to bow to the roles society forced upon them turned them into something far greater than simple outlaws. They became legends. For centuries their names have been whispered in the same breath as Blackbeard, Kidd, and Roberts. Not because of great fleets or golden treasure, but because they embodied the purest spirit of rebellion. In a time when women were expected to remain silent, obedient, and confined to the home, Anne and Mary strode the decks of pirate ships with pistols drawn and curses flying. They fought not as exceptions, but as equals, and often as leaders. Their legend grew quickly, fanned by the publication of a general history of the pirates in 1724, written by the mysterious Captain Charles Johnson. In its pages, their stories were immortalized. Anne, the fiery daughter of rebellion. Mary, the hardened soldier who lived in disguise. The book painted them as larger-than-life figures, scandalous and daring, and the world devoured every word. From then on, their place in pirate lore was secured. Historians debate how much of their story was truth and how much was embellished. Did Anne truly stab a servant in her youth? Did Mary really threaten to kill her shipmates for their cowardice? Did Anne escape prison and live out her days quietly, or did she meet some darker end? The records are fragmentary, and mystery clings to them like mist on the sea. But perhaps that uncertainty only adds to their power. What cannot be denied is the impact they left behind. In every retelling, Anne and Mary stand as symbols of defiance, not just against kings and laws, but against the expectations of their own time. They remind us that piracy was not only about plunder, but about freedom. To Anne and Mary, freedom meant living fiercely, drinking deeply, fighting boldly, and refusing to let anyone dictate the terms of their lives. In modern times, their legend has only grown stronger. They appear in novels, plays, films, and video games. They are celebrated as early icons of female rebellion, women who refuse to be bound by the shackles of their gender. Their faces, imagined again and again through art, still inspire awe. But beyond the myth, the core of their story remains simple and human. Two women who found one another in the most unlikely of places, aboard a pirate ship, and shared a bond forged in danger and fire. Allies, comrades, perhaps even lovers, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, remind us that history's greatest tales are not always about crowns and kingdoms, but about individuals who dared to live differently. As the centuries roll on, the sea continues to whisper their names. Somewhere in the crash of the waves and the creak of old timbers, their laughter, their curses, and the echo of their pistols linger still. To sail with Anne Bonny and Mary Read was to sail with fire. And though their time upon the waves was brief, the flame they lit has never gone out. And so, the story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read comes to a close. Their lives were short, brutal, and uncertain, but their names live on in history, standing as two of the fiercest figures of the Golden Age of Piracy. They were not queens in palaces, nor commanders of great fleets. They were outsiders who carved their own path on a man's sea, who lived with fire in their hearts and pistols at their sides. When we look back on the Golden Age of Piracy, it's easy to be dazzled by the great names: Blackbeard with his smoking beard, Bartholomew Roberts with his wealth, William Kidd with his trial. But what makes Anne and Mary unforgettable is not treasure or terror, it's their defiance. They refused to live quietly. They refused to play the roles written for them. And in that defiance they found a kind of immortality. Anne Bonny, whose fate remains cloaked in mystery, may have slipped quietly into obscurity. Mary Read, who died in prison, never saw freedom again. But together, for a brief and blazing moment, they became legends. Pirates whose courage and spirit outshone even their captain. Their story reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings and empires. Sometimes, It is shaped by rebels who dared to live differently, who chose freedom over fear, and who, in their refusal to be silenced, left behind echoes that still reach us today.
And now, I'll turn to you. If you had stood in their place, what would you have chosen? Would you have walked away from safety and law for a life of danger, freedom, and rebellion on the sea? Or would you have stayed ashore, watching the tide carry their names into legend? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Thank you for joining me on this voyage, not just tonight, but through the whole journey across the Golden Age of Piracy. From Blackbeard's terror to Roberts's discipline, from Kidd's downfall to Vane's fury, from Rackham's flamboyance to the fire of Anne and Mary, we've sailed through a world that was as brutal as it was captivating.
The series may end here, but the sea is endless, and its stories never truly die. Whenever you hear the crash of waves or see the black silhouette of a sail against the horizon, remember that once, long ago, the world trembled at the sound of the Jolly Roger snapping in the wind. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, carry with you the memory of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who refused to yield, who fought to the end, and who proved that legends are not born, but made. Until our next tale together, may your nights be calm, your dreams adventurous, and your seas forever free.